ほら、ルフィ、今一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
Hello guys, welcome to my channel The Wandering Zoro, your go-to destination for anime-related content. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. In today's video, we're going to be diving into this series, so be sure to stick around until the end, and let's get started. Izuku Yagi, as usual, was invisible. At just 4 years old, he couldn't quite grasp the enormity of it all. The world, to him, was still mostly colors and sounds and shapes that didn't fully make sense, a blur of 2 bright lights and 2 loud voices. But even with a child's limited understanding, he knew enough to recognize the hollow, aching feeling that had settled somewhere deep inside his chest. He didn't understand. Why did his parents' eyes always seem to pass over him, as though he were just a shadow on the wall? They would look past him, never at him, gaze sliding off his small frame, as if he were part of the furniture, as if he were a coat rack or a lamp that had always been there, and therefore required no attention. Why did his sister, once his closest companion, now look at him with disdain, her words sharp and cutting, like shards of glass embedding themselves into his small heart? He remembered when she used to cling to his hand and tug him toward toys and cartoons, when her laughter used to sound like an invitation instead of a weapon. Why did even the children he once called friends mock him, their laughter ringing in his ears like a cruel symphony, their mouths stretched too wide, their teeth too bright, their eyes gleaming not with joy, but with a strange, ugly delight whenever he flinched? Why, in the eyes of everyone around him, did he feel less than human, like there was some invisible line dividing him from them? And no matter how much he reached out, his fingers could never quite cross it. The questions swirled in his mind, heavy and suffocating, but no answers came. They circled and circled, tight and dizzying, until thinking about them made his head hurt. All he knew was the ache in his chest and the lump in his throat that refused to go away, an uncomfortable weight that made swallowing feel difficult and breathing feel just a little bit harder than it should have been. The waiting room of the court doctor's office was a cacophony of sound and movement. The high-pitched squeals of excited children filled the air, bubbling over like soda shaken too hard, mingling with the nervous murmurs of parents trying to mask their unease. Voices overlapped, some bright with anticipation, others low and tense, all blending into a restless hum that seemed to vibrate in Izuku's bones. The faint hum of the overhead lights buzzed softly, a constant droning note that sat just on the edge of his awareness, almost drowned out by the rustling of magazines and the occasional chime of the receptionist's phone. The plastic chairs creaked as people shifted, the vinyl groaning under shifting weight. A television mounted in the corner flickered muted images of heroes battling villains, colorful capes and explosions flashing across the screen. But the sound was turned down low, the muffled voice of the anchor barely audible under the din. Izuku sat quietly in his chair, his small legs dangling above the floor, swinging back and forth in an unconscious rhythm. His sneakers, scuffed at the toes, tapped lightly against the underside of the seat with each swing, making a soft thudding sound he barely noticed. His hands gripped the edge of the seat, the worn fabric rough and slightly scratchy against his tiny fingers, the metal frame cold where it peeked through the upholstery. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp and sterile, a smell that made his nose wrinkle and his eyes sting just a little. Beneath it, he could catch hints of other scents. Someone's too strong cologne, the faint sugary whiff of candy a child was trying to sneak when their parent wasn't looking, the paper and ink smell of old magazines stacked on the low table nearby. Inko Yagi sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The tendons in her wrists stood out as she squeezed, as if she were physically holding herself together. Her gaze flickered nervously between the clock on the wall and the door to the doctor's office, her lips pressed into a thin line that had long since forgotten how to curve into an easy smile. She tried to focus on the muted television in the corner, where a news anchor was enthusiastically recounting the latest hero exploits, flashes of All Might's broad grin, the triumphant way he held his fist in the air, but her mind was elsewhere. What if something was wrong? What if her precious boy wasn't okay? The thought gnawed at her, a persistent, unwelcome visitor in her mind that refused to be reasoned with. She glanced down at Izuku, who was staring at the floor, his wide green eyes clouded with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. His lashes cast faint shadows on his cheeks, and every so often, he blinked, slow and deliberate, as if trying to clear away thoughts that were too big for his small head. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment caught in that fragile space between worry and hesitation before resting gently on his shoulder. His t-shirt was soft and a little worn under her palm, the small rise and fall of his breathing subtle, but noticeable. He didn't react. He didn't lean into the touch or look up at her. He just kept staring at the floor as though something infinitely important was written there, something only he could see. When the door finally opened, the sound of it creaking on its hinges seemed to echo through the room, slicing through the ambient noise like a blade. Conversations faltered, a few heads turning instinctively toward the source. A man in a white coat stepped out, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying a weight that made Inko's heart skip a beat. There were faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the kind carved by years of delivering news that wasn't always good. A clipboard rested in his hand, papers clipped neatly in place, a pen tucked behind one ear. "Mrs. Yagi," he called, his voice calm but firm, filling the space without needing to be loud. Inko stood quickly, her knees feeling unsteady as if they'd forgotten how to support her. She gripped Izuku's hand, his small fingers cool and limp in her grasp, and motioned for Izumi to follow. The little girl bounded up, her energy a stark contrast to her brother's subdued demeanor. Her pigtails bounced with each step, tied with bright ribbons that flashed with every movement, and she clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. The toy's fur was worn in patches, one ear slightly bent, but to Izumi, it was a treasured companion, held in the crook of her arm like a fellow adventurer. The doctor led them into his office, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded half. The walls were lined with certificates and framed photos, handshakes with prominent figures, congratulatory documents printed in neat black font, and shelves filled with thick medical textbooks whose titles Izuku couldn't read yet. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, bitter and rich, mingling with the sterile smell that seemed to permeate the entire building. A computer hummed quietly on the desk, a screensaver drifting lazily across the monitor. A small potted plant sat in the corner, its leaves glossy and well cared for, a half-hearted attempt to make the room feel less clinical. Inko sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, fingers woven together as if in prayer, while Izuku climbed into the chair beside her, his movements slow and hesitant. The vinyl squeaked softly beneath his weight, and for a brief second, he shifted, trying to find a position that didn't make him feel so exposed. Izumi plopped into her seat with a grin, her legs swinging as she hummed a cheerful tune under her breath. The stool wobbled just a little with her movement, but she didn't seem to notice or care. The doctor settled into his chair, the wheels rolling a little before stopping. His gaze shifted between the family before him, lingering a moment longer on Izuku, then Izumi, then back to Inko, as if arranging his thoughts to match the faces in front of him. He cleared his throat, and the sound seemed to reverberate in the small room, making Inko's heart pound even harder. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a cool, even glow that made everything feel too sharp, too clear. "Would you like the good or bad news first?" he asked, his tone carefully measured, each word placed with deliberate care. Inko's stomach churned, her palms growing damp with sweat. She could feel a bead of perspiration sliding slowly down her spine beneath her blouse, uncomfortably warm against her skin. Her mind raced, imagining every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. Something was wrong. Something had to be wrong. Why else would he ask that question? Doctors only asked things like that in shows and movies when they were about to say something terrible. Her voice trembled as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "The bad news, please." The doctor hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, his eyes softening just a fraction. "There's no easy way to say this," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "But Izuku won't be developing a quirk." He paused, watching as the words sank in. They seemed to fall through the air in slow motion, heavy and inevitable, landing in the pit of Inko's stomach like stones. She felt the breath leave her lungs in a quiet, shaky exhale. Beside her, Izuka didn't move, but something in him went very still. You see, after quirks started appearing, a significant amount of research was conducted. The doctor continued. As he spoke, his voice slipped into a practiced rhythm, talking about extra joints and toes and inherited traits and statistical odds, about markers in bones and charts and percentages. His words were long and complicated, full of terms that made perfect sense to adults, but might as well have been a foreign language to a 4-year-old. As the doctor continued, delving into the science and studies behind quirks, Izuka's world seemed to crumble around him. The words blurred together, a meaningless jumble of syllables that washed over him like a cold, relentless tide. He caught fragments won't manifest, no quirk factor, unfortunately, but they came to him warped and distant, like they were being spoken underwater. His ears rang faintly, and his own heartbeat sounded loud in his head, a rapid, frightened drum. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding painfully against his ribs, as though it was trying to escape. He wanted to cry, to scream, to ask why this was happening, to ask what he had done wrong, to demand if there was some mistake, if maybe the machines were broken or the doctor had read the wrong file. But his tongue felt heavy, his mouth dry, the questions dying before they could reach his lips. Now, on the other hand, Izumi is a completely different story. The doctor's voice cut through the heavy silence in the room, sharp and abrupt, pulling Inko's attention away from her son. She had been watching him closely, her heart aching at the sight of his downcast eyes and the way his small hands gripped the edge of the chair, as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. But now, her focus shifted to her daughter, who sat on the examination table, swinging her legs innocently, heels thumping lightly against the side, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Inko straightened, her back tense with anticipation. A new feeling bubbled up within her, hope mixed with trepidation, as she hung on the doctor's every word. The air seemed to thicken, her breathing shallow as she waited. She has a power-type quirk, the doctor continued, his tone clinical but tinged with intrigue. He glanced at the clipboard in his hands, flipping through the pages with a soft rustle of paper. The sound seemed loud in the suffocating quiet. From reviewing your family's quirk file, I see that you have a telekinesis quirk and your husband is quirkless. Is that correct? Inko nodded quickly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Yes, that's right, she confirmed, her voice trembling slightly. She leaned forward, her breath catching, as though she could pull the answers from him faster if she willed it. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the room, but Inko barely noticed. Her mind was racing with possibilities, her heart thudding in her chest in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The doctor adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Well, it seems that Izumi's quirk, rather than being a direct inheritance, is a mutation. A unique combination, if you will. He paused for effect, his gaze shifting briefly to the little girl who was now trying to balance one of her shoes on her knee, tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The shoe slipped and thumped softly against the table, and she giggled to herself. She appears to possess a strong telekinesis quirk, much like yours, Mrs. Midoriya, but it's fused with a strength-based quirk. The result is remarkable. Inko's breath hitched, and she felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest, flooding her limbs with a light, giddy sensation. Her daughter, her sweet, cheerful Izumi, was special. The doctor's words seemed to echo in her mind, and she clung to them like a lifeline. Special, remarkable, extraordinary. Monitor her progress as she grows, he continued, his voice steady but laced with a hint of awe. Her potential is extraordinary. I have a strong suspicion that she will become one of the greatest heroes of her generation. She's going places, ma'am. Tears pricked at the corners of Inko's eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked rapidly, but a few escaped anyway, warm trails sliding down her cheeks. She reached out instinctively, gathering Izumi into her arms and lifting her off the table with ease. The little girl squealed in delight, her laughter ringing out like a melody that filled the room and seemed to drive back the sterile chill. Her arms wrapped around Inko's neck, small fingers digging into the fabric of her blouse. "Did you hear that, Izumi? You're going to be amazing." Inko's voice was thick with emotion, a mixture of pride, relief, and joy. The words came out a little shaky, but they were full, overflowing. She held her daughter close, her heart swelling as she imagined the bright future that awaited her hero costumes and flashing cameras and crowds chanting her name. A future shining so brilliantly that it almost hurt to look at it directly. But off to the side, perched on a small stool, Izuku sat frozen. His green eyes, usually so full of life and curiosity, were wide and unblinking. The overhead lights reflected faintly in them, turning them into twin, glassy mirrors. The words of the doctor seemed to echo in his mind, but they felt distant, as though they were being spoken to someone else entirely, in a room he couldn't enter. His chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. He wanted to feel happy for his sister, he really did, but the weight of his own reality was crushing him. Each word about her potential, her power, her future pressed down on him like another layer of invisible stone. The ride home was quiet, save for Inko's excited chatter. She couldn't stop talking about Izumi's quirk, her voice animated and full of hope as she painted a picture of her daughter's heroic future. Her sentences ran together, spilling over in her rush to share every detail the doctor had given them, every possibility she had already begun to imagine. Izumi, seated beside her, giggled and clung to her mother's arm, basking in the attention. She swung her legs and occasionally made whooshing noises, mimicking the heroes she'd seen on TV, completely absorbed in her own bright little world. Izuku, however, sat silently in the back seat, the fabric of the car's seat rough under his small hands as he clutched at it. He stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, streaks of white and yellow smearing together as the car moved. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a pale, ghostly version of himself. The double image outside world and faint boy-shaped outline made him feel even less solid, as if he really might be just another shadow. When they arrived home, Inko practically burst through the door, calling out to her husband. "Toshi, you won't believe it," she exclaimed, her voice carrying through the house, bouncing off the walls and filling every corner. Toshinori appeared from the kitchen, his tall frame filling the doorway, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. The faint smell of whatever he'd been cooking, something savory and warm, clung to him, drifting in from the room behind. His eyes lit up at the sight of his family, and he smiled warmly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "What is it, my dear?" he asked, his voice rich and soothing, the kind of sound that usually made Izuku feel safe. Inko didn't wait for him to finish. Her words bubbled out in a rush, her voice bright and full of uncontainable excitement. She launched into an animated recount of the doctor's assessment, her hands moving wildly, painting pictures in the air as she spoke. "Izumi's quirk is incredible. The doctor said it's a rare combination of traits, something they've hardly ever seen before. It's not just powerful, it's unique. Can you believe it?" Her eyes sparkled, catching the light like tiny stars, her pride and amazement radiating from her in waves. She leaned forward slightly, as though the closer she got, the more her enthusiasm could reach the world around her. Her voice climbed higher with every word, each syllable charged with a contagious energy. "They said she has the potential to do things no one else has ever done, things that could change everything." The room seemed to buzz with her excitement, her words bouncing off the walls and filling the space with their electric charge. Toshinori's expression shifted from curiosity to awe to pride in quick succession, his gaze drawn to the daughter at the center of this unfolding miracle. Izuku sat frozen, his lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came out. His presence was a shadow in the corner of the room, unnoticed and unimportant. Nobody spared him a glance, let alone a thought. Their eyes were all on Izumi, on her bright smile, on her shining eyes, on the future they saw when they looked at her. He was invisible, forgotten. The laughter and chatter of his family swirled around him like a storm he couldn't escape, a whirlwind of joy and celebration that he had no part in. Their voices overlapped, Izumi's high-pitched giggles weaving through Inko's enthusiastic descriptions and Toshinori's low, impressed comments. It pressed against him, suffocating and deafening, until he couldn't take it anymore. He slipped away, his feet carrying him up the stairs as if on autopilot. The familiar creak of the second step under his weight sounded louder than usual, but no one called after him. No one asked where he was going. The sounds of their happiness followed him, trailing behind like a cruel reminder of everything he lacked. Even with the door to the living room receding behind him, he could still hear them, muffled but persistent. Once in his room, he closed the door softly, the faint click of the latch somehow louder in the sudden quiet. The noise cut off the voices downstairs almost completely, leaving only a distant murmur. He stood there for a moment, staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fibers of the carpet were rough under his bare toes, grounding him just enough to stop him from floating away on the tide of his thoughts. His chest felt tight, his throat raw with the effort of holding back the sobs that threatened to break free. His breaths came in short, shallow pulls, each one catching a little. Slowly, he sank onto the edge of his bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. The springs gave a faint squeak, the familiar sound oddly comforting in its predictability. His gaze was fixed on the wall, but he wasn't really seeing it. The faint marks where posters might one day hang, the tiny scuff near the corner, none of it registered. All he could hear was the echo of his mother's voice, the pride in her tone as she spoke about Izumi. All he could feel was the ache in his chest, a hollow, gnawing pain that seemed to grow with every passing second, chewing away at the edges of whatever hope he had left. He didn't understand. Why? Why was he the one born without a quirk? Why was he the one left behind, forgotten, while his sister shone so brightly? The questions swirled in his mind, each one sharper than the last, cutting into him like shards of glass. He had tried to accept it, tried to come to terms with the fact that he was different. He had told himself over and over that it was okay, that he didn't need a quirk to be worth something. But no matter how hard he tried, the longing never went away. The desire burned within him, fierce and unrelenting, a fire that refused to be extinguished. It licked at his ribs, hot and restless, turning every breath into a reminder of what he didn't have. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision, and this time he didn't fight them. They spilled over, hot and silent, tracing paths down his cheeks. They dripped onto his hands, leaving tiny, dark spots on his clenched fists before soaking into the bedding. He didn't make a sound, didn't sob or wail. He just sat there, letting the tears fall, his shoulders trembling with the weight of his emotions. The quiet felt fragile, like it might shatter if he breathed too loudly. He felt small, insignificant, like a single star trying to shine in a sky already filled with constellations. No matter how much he tried to glow, his light was always swallowed up, lost against the brilliance of others. But even as the tears fell, even as the pain threatened to consume him, a spark of determination flickered to life within him. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, refusing to be snuffed out. It sat somewhere deep in his chest, stubborn and warm, a tiny ember resisting the suffocating weight pressing down on him. He clenched his fists tighter, his nails digging into his palms, grounding him. The sting was small, but it reminded him that he was still here, that he could still feel. He might not have a quirk, might not have the thing he wanted most in the world, but that didn't mean he was powerless. That didn't mean he couldn't be a hero. At least he hoped. The next day at school, the classroom was filled with a peculiar hush, the kind that made every scrape of a chair or shuffle of a notebook sound deafening. The usual morning chatter was dulled, eyes flickering toward him and then away, whispers dying quickly when the teacher looked their way. The teacher stood at the front, her expression a mixture of sternness and discomfort, as though she were trying to balance authority with compassion. The chalk in her hand left faint dust on her fingers, and the blackboard behind her still held half-erased notes from the previous lesson. Her voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of hesitation as she informed the class about Izuku's quirkless nature. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, as though they weighed their own. "Remember," she said, her tone softening as she glanced in his direction without quite meeting his eyes, "Izuku is still upset. Please be kind to him." But the plea felt like a pebble tossed into a vast ocean, barely rippling the surface of their ingrained perceptions. For Izuku, the moment was excruciating. He could feel the stares, sharp and probing, like needles pricking at his skin. Some were openly curious, others thinly veiled with pity, a few tinged with something meaner relief that it wasn't them. The room seemed colder, the air heavier, pressing down on him as if the very walls were closing in. The squeak of a chair leg against the floor sounded too loud. The scratch of a pencil on paper grated against his ears. He kept his eyes glued to his desk, the faint grain of the wood becoming his sole focus, as if by staring hard enough he could disappear into it. A small nick near the corner, a faint scribble where someone had pressed too hard while drawing, that was his whole world in that moment. A lump formed in his throat, and he swallowed hard, the motion painful, willing himself not to cry. He couldn't bear to give them another reason to see him as weak. It was painfully ironic. These were children who one day dreamed of becoming heroes, symbols of hope, defenders of the weak, protectors of the innocent. They drew capes and masks in their notebooks, argued over the best hero agencies, mimicked catchphrases and victory poses. And yet, here they were, the same ones who had mocked and belittled him, tearing him down simply because he wasn't like them, because he didn't have a quirk, because he was different. Their laughter, their whispers, their pointed fingers, all of it echoed in his mind, a cacophony of cruelty that drowned out the teacher's words. Snatches of taunts he'd heard before replayed themselves without mercy. The very people who aspired to save others seemed to have no qualms about wounding someone who didn't fit their mold. Izuku's thoughts churned, a storm of anger, sadness, and confusion. The emotions clashed against each other inside him, leaving him exhausted and restless all at once. How could they not see the contradiction? How could they claim to want to make the world better when they were the ones making it so much harder for someone like him? He clenched his fists under the desk, his nails digging into his palms, the faint sting grounding him. His hands were hidden from view, but he could feel the faint tremble in his fingers. All Might had always said that heroes made the world safe, that they were the pillars holding up society. Izuku had believed that, still wanted to believe it with everything he had. But even All Might, the greatest hero of them all, couldn't erase the flaws in this world. A world that worshipped strength and perfection, leaving no room for those who didn't fit the ideal. The truth was, the world couldn't function without All Might. He was the glue holding everything together, the beacon that kept people moving forward. Adults said it. The news said it. Even kids repeated it like a fact. But what happened when someone like Izuku came along? Someone who wasn't strong, who wasn't perfect, someone who didn't have the thing everyone else took for granted? The cracks in society became glaringly obvious, and no amount of heroism could fill them. Izuku's chest tightened as he realized the bitter truth. The world wasn't safe, not really. Not for everyone, not for someone like him. The irony of it all was suffocating. The very people who were supposed to inspire hope had become the source of his despair. The very system that claimed to protect the weak had left him exposed and vulnerable, standing alone under a spotlight he had never asked for. Izuku wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers from a world that seemed so hopelessly broken, to stand up and shout that it wasn't fair, that they were wrong about him, about what being a hero meant. But instead, he sat there in silence, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like an invisible hand. His shoulders curled inward, instinctively trying to make himself smaller, to take up as little space as possible. And as the teacher's voice droned on, fading into the background hum of the classroom, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever find a place where he truly belonged. Narration. I can't help but continue doubting the entire concept of pro-heroes. The more I watch them, the more that doubt crawls under my skin and settles there, stubborn and immovable. The way they present themselves, the flashy costumes, the over-the-top speeches, it all feels like a carefully constructed performance, not unlike pro wrestlers putting on a show for the cameras. There's always a pose, always a line, always that bright, rehearsed smile ready the moment a lens turns their way. There's this undeniable sense of artificiality in how they act when they know they're being recorded. Every move, every word, every dramatic pose seems calculated, as though they're more concerned with their public image than the lives they're supposedly protecting. It's like watching someone read from a script they've memorized front to back, rather than witnessing genuine instinct or compassion. Behind the glittering facade of fame and fortune, I can't shake the feeling that most of them are only in it for selfish reasons. The sponsorship logos stamped across their gear, the way they angle themselves so the cameras catch every emblem, every brand, it's hard to ignore. Sure, some might claim they're doing it to save people, to make the world a better place, but how many of them truly mean it? Strip away the cameras, the endorsements, the adoring fans, and what's left? If the stadium lights went dark and the reporters all went home, would they still stand between danger and the people who needed them? For many, I suspect it's nothing but a hollow desire for money or the pursuit of some ulterior motive they'd rather keep hidden. A hunger for attention, a craving for validation, a desperate need to be seen as something larger than life. It's disheartening to think that the very people we're supposed to look up to, the ones we trust to protect us, might be nothing more than actors playing a part for their own gain. Heroes in name, but not in heart. After school, 2 years later, after another grueling day of bullying from Izumi and Katsuki, Izuku felt the weight of their torment pressing harder than ever. His notebook bore the evidence of their cruelty. Fresh creases marred its cover. Pages crumpled and bent at the corners where it had been snatched from his grasp and carelessly tossed aside. Every time he glanced at it, he was reminded of their sneering faces, the sharp laughter that echoed in his ears long after the classroom had emptied. His shoulder ached faintly, a dull throb left behind from the moment someone had shoved him hard into a desk when the teacher's back was turned. The sting of muttered insults clung to him like a stubborn shadow, words that burrowed deep into his mind and refused to let go. They hurt more than the physical bruises, carving invisible wounds that felt impossible to heal. Now, finally away from the school's oppressive atmosphere, he was on his way home. Izuku walked with his head bowed slightly, his gaze fixed on the pavement as if the cracks and lines might offer him some distraction, some escape. The late afternoon sun stretched across the streets, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him, pulling him deeper into his thoughts. The air was warm, wrapping around him like a blanket he couldn't quite decide was comforting or suffocating. It carried a medley of scents: the faint tang of exhaust fumes from passing cars, the enticing aroma of roasted chestnuts wafting from a nearby food stand, and the sharp, electric smell of ozone drifting from somewhere down the street, likely the result of someone's quirk sparking to life. The straps of his backpack dug into his shoulders, the familiar weight of his notebooks and pens pressing against his spine. It was a sensation he'd grown used to, almost comforting in its predictability, but today it felt heavier than usual, as though the burden of his belongings mirrored the weight of his thoughts. Each step he took was soft and measured, his shoes scuffing lightly against the concrete in a rhythm that was almost soothing. But no matter how steady his pace, no matter how he tried to lose himself in the monotony of walking, his mind remained restless, replaying the events of the day in an endless loop. Then, as he rounded a corner, Izuku halted mid-step, his attention snagged by a sudden commotion ahead. The sound of raised voices reached his ears, sharp and urgent, cutting through the hum of the city around him. His pulse quickened as he strained to see what was happening, his curiosity momentarily overriding the heaviness in his chest. Up the street, a cluster of people had gathered, their bodies forming a loose semicircle that spilled onto the road. Curious murmurs drifted back toward him in uneven waves, punctuated by the occasional excited shout. Phones were already out, little rectangles of glass held high, screens reflecting the afternoon light. A hero is in the middle of apprehending a petty thief, some low-tier villain who doesn't even seem to be trying. The villain is scrawny, his tattered clothes hanging off him like a scarecrow, the fabric stained and threadbare. His shoes look a size too big, soles peeling at the edges, and his movements are sluggish, almost resigned. There's no manic grin, no wild threats, just a drained, exhausted expression that makes him look more like a cornered animal than a mastermind. The hero, on the other hand, is all bravado, a flashy top 50 ranker whose costume practically glows under the sunlight. His outfit is a carefully tailored blend of bright colors and sleek lines, the material clinging to his frame just right, a cape billowing dramatically behind him every time he so much as shifts his weight. He's playing to the crowd, tossing out quips like confetti, his exaggerated gestures drawing cheers and laughter from the onlookers. When he strikes a pose, the metal accents on his costume catch the light and flash, like he's carrying his own personal spotlight. The scene feels more like a performance than an arrest, and Izuku's stomach churns at the thought, a nauseating twist that crawls up his throat. The air feels heavy, charged with tension, yet somehow artificial, as though every movement and sound is part of an elaborate script. He can hear the hero's voice cutting through the cacophony of the street, loud and theatrical, each word enunciated with painstaking precision, the kind of clarity that ensures the nearest cameras catch every syllable. There's a rhythm to it, a calculated rise and fall in his tone that seems choreographed for maximum effect, each pause meant to emphasize his dominance and control. The villain barely resists, his body sagging under the weight of defeat. Izuku watches as the man's shoulders slump, his posture crumbling like a marionette whose strings have been cut. The hero grips his arms with the practiced ease of someone who's done this 100 times before, pulling them behind his back with a flourish that borders on theatrical. For a brief moment, a flicker of light dances at the villain's fingertips, a weak, sputtering pulse of his quirk that dies out almost instantly, as though even his power has resigned itself to failure. The sight sends a pang of unease through Izuku's chest, a sharp contrast to the hero's triumphant display. It feels wrong, somehow like watching a predator toy with its prey. Just as the hero snaps the cuffs around the villain's wrists, the scene shifts. Something goes wrong. A sudden puff of smoke erupts from the villain's hands, his quirk apparently triggered by accident. The smoke is harmless, more like the kind you'd see at a cheap magic show, pale and wispy, curling through the air in lazy tendrils that dissipate almost as quickly as they appear. It smells faintly of burnt paper, the kind of acrid scent that lingers unpleasantly in the back of the throat. Izuku instinctively takes a step back, the unexpectedness of the moment jarring him, though his rational mind tells him there's no danger here. But it's enough. It's enough to shatter the hero's carefully constructed composure. The man who had been so polished, so perfectly poised just moments ago, suddenly unravels. He flails, his movements wild and uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings have been tangled. His polished posture crumbles in an instant, replaced by frantic, jerky motions that seem almost desperate. He swings his arm in a wide arc, a panic swipe more than a calculated strike, the kind of movement born of instinct rather than strategy. The sound of his fists slicing through the air is sharp, a whistle that cuts through the chaos. It misses the villain entirely, aimed at nothing and everything, a blind attempt to regain control. The ground beneath them feels like it's vibrating, the impact of the hero's movements sending faint tremors through the heated concrete. Dust kicks up around them, mingling with the smoke to create a hazy veil that blurs the edges of the scene. The smell of dust and heated concrete fills the air, earthy and suffocating, wrapping around Izuku like an unwelcome blanket. He can feel the grit of it settling on his skin, clinging to the sweat that's begun to bead on his forehead. The noise of the street seems to swell, a cacophony of footsteps, murmurs, and the distant hum of traffic blending into an overwhelming roar. Izuku's heart pounds in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. His stomach twists again, tighter this time, as he watches the hero's mask of control slip further and further away. There's something unsettling about the whole thing, something that gnaws at the edges of his mind and refuses to be ignored. He feels a flicker of doubt, a quiet voice in the back of his head whispering that this isn't how it's supposed to be. Heroes are supposed to be calm, collected, a beacon of stability in the chaos. But this is something else entirely. Something raw and unrefined, a glimpse behind the curtain that he hadn't been prepared for. The punch misses its intended target entirely, instead connecting with the side of a nearby building. The impact is deafening, a sharp crack that reverberates through the street. The wall buckles inward under the force, spiderweb fractures racing outward from the point of contact. For a heartbeat, everything stills. Then the top layer of the wall gives way. The sound is deafening, a sharp, thunderous crack that seems to split the air apart. Dust and chunks of concrete explode outward, a chaotic spray of gray and white, filling the street with a choking cloud. The acrid tang of pulverized stone stings the back of Izuku's throat as he instinctively inhales, his lungs burning with the sharp, dry grit. Uneven chunks of debris rain down, bouncing off the pavement with hollow, jarring thuds. Izuku's eyes widen, his pupils shrinking as he watches the chaos unfold in front of him. His heart pounds against his ribcage, the rhythm erratic and wild. Time seems to slow, the world narrowing to the scene before him, every detail searing itself into his mind. He sees the debris begin to fall, jagged gray shards tumbling through the air in what feels like an agonizingly slow motion, their edges catching the dim sunlight as they spin. And that's when he notices her. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, maybe around his age, stands frozen on the sidewalk. Her tiny frame is dwarfed by the towering buildings around her, and she looks impossibly small against the backdrop of destruction. Her wide, terrified eyes are locked on the descending rubble, unblinking and glassy, as though she's caught in some terrible nightmare she cannot wake from. Her small body is stiff, every muscle rigid, as if the fear has rooted her to the ground, trapping her in place. She clutches a stuffed rabbit to her chest, the toy almost as big as she is. Its once pristine white fur is now matted and gray with soot, the result of the chaos that had already unfolded moments earlier. One of the rabbit's button eyes is scratched, the black thread around it fraying and loose, giving the toy an oddly forlorn expression. Her tiny fingers dig into the rabbit's fabric, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, as the thing anchoring her to reality. Izuku's breath catches in his throat, sharp and painful, as his heart lurches violently in his chest. A wave of cold dread washes over him, icy and suffocating, as he takes in the scene. The girl is directly in the path of the falling debris, and she doesn't move. She doesn't even flinch. He wants to move. He needs to move. Every fiber of his being screams at him to do something, anything, to shout, to run, to reach out and pull her out of the way. But his body betrays him. His feet feel like they're encased in cement, heavy and immovable, and his legs refuse to respond no matter how desperately he wills them to. Move, his mind commands, the word echoing over and over again in his head, a frantic, desperate chant. Move, move, move. But his body remains frozen, paralyzed by fear and the sheer weight of the moment. His throat tightens, the beginning of a warning, a scream, a shout, anything lodged somewhere between his lungs and his tongue. He tries to force it out, to give voice to the panic clawing at his insides. But all that escapes is a strangled, breathless sound, lost in the cacophony around him. The crowd around him erupts in a collective gasp, their cheers and chatter dying in an instant. The air is thick with tension, the silence that follows almost deafening in its weight. Horrified murmurs ripple outward like shockwaves, the fear spreading from person to person as they realize the danger unfolding before their eyes. Somewhere nearby, someone drops their phone, the device clattering against the pavement with a sharp, brittle sound that seems to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. The noise startles Izuku, but he doesn't look away. He can't. His gaze is locked on the girl, on the way her tiny frame trembles, on the way her wide eyes reflect the falling rubble like mirrors of terror. A child starts crying somewhere behind him, the thin, high-pitched wail cutting through the rising panic like a knife. The sound makes Izuku's stomach twist, a visceral reminder of the stakes, of the fragility of the life standing mere feet away from him. And still he doesn't move. The hero, oblivious to the chaos around him, continues to wave at the cameras with an air of practiced confidence, his grin stretched wide and unwavering. It's as though he's oblivious to the destruction unfolding behind him, or perhaps he simply doesn't care. His cape flutters in the smoky breeze, a striking crimson against the dull gray backdrop, but what once seemed like a symbol of valor now appears garish, almost mocking. The theatrical swish of fabric, meant to inspire awe, feels obscene amidst the wreckage. Izuku's stomach churns violently, a sickening cocktail of dread and disbelief twisting in his gut. His hands tremble at his sides, half raised as if he might lunge forward, though he knows there's nothing he can do. The acrid tang of smoke invades his senses, sharp and suffocating, making his throat tighten with every shallow breath. It mixes with the metallic scent of dust and rubble, coating his tongue and leaving a bitter aftertaste that he can't swallow away. His chest feels heavy, as though the weight of the collapsing debris has settled there instead, pressing down on him with an unbearable force. He wants to scream, to demand the hero stop his posturing and do something, anything, but the words die in his throat, strangled by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Then, like a blur slicing through the chaos, a shadow darts into view. It's sudden and almost imperceptible, moving faster than the eye can follow. The figure tall and angular, wrapped in a weathered trench coat that flares around him like wings, plunges into the heart of the destruction with an audacious certainty. The air itself seems to yield to his presence, rippling in his wake as though acknowledging his command. A faint whistle accompanies his movements, the sound barely audible over the cacophony of crumbling concrete and distant cries. Dust and smoke swirl around him, clinging to his silhouette like a cloak, yet he cuts through it effortlessly, a streak of shadow slicing the washed-out sky. In the span of a breath, he's there, standing in the epicenter of the chaos, as if he'd materialized from the void. His movements are a symphony of precision and speed, a seamless choreography that defies comprehension. Izuku struggles to keep up, his wide eyes straining to follow the blur of motion. One moment, the little girl is frozen in terror, her tiny frame trembling amidst the shifting wreckage, clutching her stuffed rabbit as though it might shield her from the falling world. The next, she's cradled safely in the stranger's arms, her face pressed against the coarse fabric of his coat, the rabbit squashed between them, but still clutched tightly in her grasp. The ground trembles as the rubble collapses in on itself, a deafening roar splitting the air and sending vibrations through Izuku's legs. A fresh wave of dust surges outward, engulfing the street in a suffocating cloud that stings his skin and burns his eyes. Tiny shards of debris lash at his cheeks and forearms like 1,000 needles, leaving faint scratches that he barely registers. He coughs violently, his throat raw and dry, as he tries to force the gritty particles from his lungs. The world feels like it's closing in, the haze thickening and swallowing everything in its path. But then, through the murky veil, Izuku sees her. The girl is safe. She's pressed close to the man's chest, her small frame dwarfed by his towering presence as he lands lightly on the cracked pavement a few feet away. His boots touch down with a grace that seems almost unnatural, the sound of his arrival barely a whisper against the chaos. Controlled. Precise. The kind of movement honed through years of practice and countless battles fought in the shadows. The man kneels, lowering the girl gently to the ground. For a moment, he remains crouched at her level, his presence steady and grounding amidst the turmoil. His hand moves with deliberate care, brushing a stray bit of dust from her hair before flicking away a stubborn gray fleck clinging to the strands. The gesture is almost tender, a fleeting moment of humanity from someone who seems otherwise detached from the scene around him. Then he straightens, his movements fluid but unhurried, and his face comes into view, a sharp jawline that looks like it could cut glass, accentuated by the pale, almost ghostly quality of his skin under the dim light. Dark circles hang heavy beneath his eyes, deep shadows that suggest countless nights spent awake, consumed by something. Or perhaps nothing at all. They lend him an air of exhaustion that seems to seep into his very being, as if sleep is a luxury he's long since abandoned. His expression, however, is what draws the most attention. It's not just disinterest, it's a kind of practiced indifference, a look that seems to say he's already made peace with how little he cares. His lips are pressed into a thin line, neither a frown nor a smile, but something in between, a mask of apathy that refuses to crack. His hair is another story altogether. Slightly messy, it falls across his forehead in uneven strands, as though he'd run a hand through it in a moment of frustration or impatience and then decided it wasn't worth fixing. There's a certain charm to the imperfection, an unpolished edge that matches the rest of his demeanor. The faint sheen of sweat at his temples catches the light, hinting at either the heat of the room or perhaps the weight of whatever thoughts occupy his mind. He doesn't even spare the hero a proper glance. His gaze, cold and calculating, sweeps over the crowd instead, scanning faces with an air of detached boredom. It's as though he's watching a play he's seen too many times before, every line, every movement already predictable to him. The noise of the crowd murmurs, shuffling feet, the occasional cough fades into the background, barely registering in his consciousness. His eyes, dark and piercing, seem to look through people rather than at them, as if searching for something or someone that might finally surprise him. But nothing does. His shoulders sag slightly, the only outward sign of his weariness, as though the weight of this repetitive scene is pressing down on him. When he finally speaks, the sound cuts through the air like a blade. His voice is low, rough, and gravelly, the kind of tone that commands attention without needing to shout. There's a deliberate quality to it, each word measured and precise, as though he's rationing his energy, unwilling to waste even a syllable. The stunned silence of the crowd amplifies his voice, making it seem louder than it really is. It's not just the tone that captures attention, though it's the weight behind it, the subtle undercurrent of authority that suggests he knows exactly what he's doing, even if he doesn't care to show it. The air seems to thicken around him, the tension palpable, as though everyone is holding their breath, waiting for what he'll say next. "Congrats," he says, the words slicing through the air like a knife wrapped in velvet smooth, but with an edge so sharp it leaves a sting. The sound lands heavy, reverberating in the space between them, sharp enough to make the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. The sarcasm isn't just in his tone. It coils around each syllable like smoke, thick and suffocating, a venomous snake waiting to strike. His voice is low, gravelly, the kind that scrapes against the ears like sandpaper dragged across raw skin. Yet it cuts through the murmurs of the crowd with unnerving precision, as if it's aimed directly at the hero's chest. The words hang there for a moment, suspended in the tension-charged air. It's not just the sound of his voice that carries the weight of his disdain, it's the way his lips curl into a smirk that doesn't quite reach his eyes, the way his gaze lingers on the hero like a predator sizing up its prey. The phrasing is different, but the intent is the same, cold, cutting, precise. A scalpel instead of a hammer. The kind of remark that doesn't need to be loud to wound. It's all in the delivery, in the deliberate way it's wielded. A ripple moves through the crowd, a shuffling of feet and averted gazes. The faint scuff of shoes against concrete mingles with the occasional rustle of fabric as people shift uncomfortably, their unease palpable. Some glance down at their phones, pretending to be engrossed in something else, anything else, while others exchange uneasy looks, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The tension is a living thing now, thick and oppressive, pressing down on everyone present. The hero's grin falters, and for a split second, the mask slips. The corners of his mouth twitch downward, betraying the crack in his carefully constructed facade. His eyes, usually so bright and confident, flicker with something else, doubt, perhaps, or maybe shame. It's hard to tell, but the moment is fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, as he forces the smile back into place. It's a strained expression, stretched too tight, the kind of smile that feels more like a grimace. His face, usually so animated, now seems unnaturally still, like a porcelain doll frozen in a mockery of human emotion. He steps forward, his movements stiff and deliberate, as though every muscle in his body is working against him. His chest puffs out, shoulders squared in a show of defiance that feels more like a desperate attempt to hold himself together. The cape draped over his shoulders flares dramatically as he moves, snapping audibly in the charged air, but the effect is hollow. The theatrics, once awe-inspiring, now feel like a cheap distraction, a desperate bid to divert attention from the rubble still settling behind him. The acrid tang of smoke lingers in the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of blood and the earthy smell of dust, a grim reminder of the destruction left in his wake. "Hey, watch your mouth," he snaps, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. But the confidence that usually underpins his words is gone, replaced by something thinner, more fragile. The bravado that once seemed unshakable now feels like a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. His voice cracks slightly on the last word, the sound jarring and uneven, like a splintered branch breaking under pressure. His hands clench into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening as if he's trying to physically hold onto the shreds of his composure. "I had it under control," he adds, the words tumbling out in a rush, as though he's trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. But the statement rings hollow, the weight of the destruction behind him rendering it little more than an empty platitude. The crowd doesn't respond, their silence louder than any words could be, a collective judgment that hangs heavy in the air. The hero stands there, his chest still heaving with the effort of maintaining his facade, as the weight of their gazes bears down on him. And for the first time, he looks small, his towering frame diminished by the enormity of his failure. The man in the trench coat doesn't seem to care. He rolls one shoulder, the leather of his coat creaking faintly with emotion, the sound low and taut, like the groan of an old ship's hull straining against the tide. It's an almost dismissive gesture, as if he's unraveling some invisible knot in his muscle, a small act of defiance against the tension in the air. His gaze, dark and unyielding, drifts away, skimming over the room like a bird in search of a perch, already bored, already done with the conversation before it's even begun. The weight of his disinterest hangs heavy, an unspoken declaration that this exchange is beneath him. Then suddenly, almost like an afterthought, his head tilts just slightly, the movement deliberate, measured, as if pulled by some unseen force. His eyes, sharp and unrelenting, find Izuku. They lock onto him with an intensity that feels like a physical blow, a blade slicing cleanly through the air and embedding itself deep between his ribs. The gaze is piercing, invasive, like it's peeling back layers of skin and sinew to expose the raw, trembling core of who Izuku is. It doesn't just see him, it dissects him, prying into the spaces he'd rather keep hidden, the places where his doubts coil and writhe like a nest of snakes. Izuku freezes under the weight of that look, his muscles stiffening as if bound by invisible chains. He feels stripped bare, as though every defense he's so carefully constructed, the hunched shoulders, the clenched fists, the determined set of his jaw, has been rendered meaningless. The man's eyes see too much, too easily, and it leaves Izuku feeling small, vulnerable, like a child caught in a lie. A smirk tugs at the corner of the man's mouth, slow and deliberate, as though he's savoring some private, bitter joke. It's not a smile meant to comfort or reassure. It's something colder, sharper, the baring of teeth before a predator strikes. The expression is a challenge, silent but unmistakable, daring Izuku to stand his ground, to prove himself worthy or to crumble under the pressure. When the man speaks again, his voice is low and gravelly, each word carefully enunciated, each syllable weighted with a quiet menace that makes the air feel heavier. His tone is devoid of warmth, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in Izuku's chest. The words cut through the silence like the crack of a whip, aimed directly at the boy, each one a deliberate strike meant to shatter what little resolve he has left. "This is what you call justice, kid?" The question hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating, and Izuku's breath catches in his throat. The room seems to shrink around him, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick and stifling. His lungs seize, refusing to draw in enough oxygen, and for a moment he feels like he's drowning, the weight of the man's words dragging him under. It's not just the question itself, it's the way it's delivered. The contempt laced through every syllable, the implication that Izuku's ideals, his dreams, are nothing more than childish fantasies. His chest tightens, ribs pressing inward like a vice, the sensation almost painful. His heart pounds against his sternum, each beat a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoes in his ears, drowning out everything else. The doubt that had been simmering quietly in the back of his mind now surges forward, a tidal wave threatening to pull him under. What if the man is right? What if everything he's fought for, everything he's believed in, is nothing more than a fragile illusion? Izuku's hands clench into fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms hard enough to leave marks. He tries to steady his breathing, to push down the rising tide of panic, but the man's words replay in his mind, each repetition striking like a hammer against the fragile foundation of his confidence. His vision blurs for a moment, and he blinks rapidly, forcing himself to focus, to hold on to some semblance of composure. But the man's gaze doesn't waver. It remains fixed on him, unrelenting, as if daring him to break, to falter, to admit defeat. And for a moment, Izuku wonders if he already has. He wants to argue, wants to choke out a defense, a plea, anything to counter the doubt gnawing at him. His chest feels tight, like a vice is clamped around his ribs, making it hard to breathe, let alone speak. His mind scrambles for something, anything to cling to, flipping through the images burned into his memory. The posters on his wall, their colors vivid and bold, promising hope and justice. The hero interviews he's watched on loop, the words ringing in his ears as if they were gospel. The scribbled quotes in his notebooks, the ink smudge from the countless times he's traced over them, seeking comfort in their certainty. Heroes save people. Heroes try their best, even when they stumble. But the words won't come. Not with the evidence still fresh in his mind, the careless swing of the hero's fist, the way it tore through the air with a deafening rush, the sound of brick and mortar crumbling as the wall gave way. He can still hear the crash, the sharp crack of stones splitting apart, the muffled cries of those caught in the chaos. He can still see the hero's grin, wide and toothy, as he turned toward the cameras, his white teeth flashing against the dust-streaked backdrop. The grin hadn't faltered, not even as a fine layer of debris rained down on the crowd below, coating their hair and shoulders in gray. And then there was the little girl. His arms feel empty now, but he can still remember her weight light, too light, like she'd been carved from air. Her small fingers had clung to his jacket, trembling, her nails digging into the fabric as if it were the only thing tethering her to safety. Her frightened eyes, wide and glassy, are seared into his mind, haunting him. He remembers the way her breath hitched against his shoulder, rapid and shallow, the way her tiny body shook as he carried her away from the wreckage. The faint scent of smoke and dust still lingers in his nose, acrid and suffocating, as though it's lodged itself there permanently. His fists clench at his sides, nails biting into his palms hard enough to leave crescent-shaped indents. The sting should hurt, should ground him, but the pain feels distant, like it's happening to someone else. It's muffled beneath the storm raging in his chest, a chaotic tangle of emotions that he can't seem to unravel. Anger burns hot and sharp, like a live wire sparking inside him, but it's tangled with a heavy, sinking disappointment that weighs him down, dragging him into dark, uncharted waters. And then there's the confusion, a twisting, gnawing thing that won't let him go. It's whispers filling his head with questions he doesn't want to ask. Is this really what it means to be a hero? The question echoes in his mind, relentless and unanswered, like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. It reverberates through him, shaking the foundation of everything he thought he knew. His gaze flickers back to the hero, the man who had once been larger than life in his eyes, a beacon of hope and strength. Now, he looks smaller somehow, diminished, his once bright aura tarnished. The hero is still posturing for the cameras, his movements calculated and precise. His hands twitch toward his belt, adjusting the angle of his emblem with the practiced ease of someone who's done it 1,000 times before. He tilts it just so, ensuring it catches the light, ensuring it shines for the lenses trained on him. The boy's stomach churns, a sick, twisting sensation that leaves him feeling hollow. He wants to look away, to shut his eyes and block out the sight, but he can't. He's rooted to the spot, his feet heavy as lead, his body unwilling to move. He wonders, not for the first time, if he's been wrong all along. If the ideals he's clung to, the dreams he's built around the idea of heroism, have been nothing more than a mirage, a glittering illusion that shatters under the weight of reality. And yet, even as doubt threatens to consume him, a spark of defiance flickers in the depths of his chest. It's small, fragile, but it's there, a tiny ember refusing to be snuffed out. This can't be all there is, he thinks, the words a desperate plea as much as a declaration. There has to be more to it than this. Before Izuku can untangle his thoughts, before he can decide whether to cling to the fraying edges of his ideals or let them unravel completely, the man in the trench coat is gone. One moment, he's there, solid and real, a shadow given form, standing like an unyielding silhouette against the chaos. The faint scent of smoke and sweat lingers in the air around him, a testament to the destruction that had just unfolded. His presence feels heavy, almost suffocating, as though the weight of his purpose radiates outward, pressing down on everything around him. Then, in the blink of an eye, he's melting into the flow of the crowd, slipping between bodies with a fluidity that seems almost unnatural, like smoke curling and dissipating into the wind. The shuffle of footsteps swallows the faint sound of his boots hitting the pavement, and the murmurs of the crowd drown out any trace of his passing. The sunlight catches the edge of his coat just once, a fleeting glint that sparks and vanishes, before the shifting mass of people closes in, erasing him. All that remains is the faintest whisper of his presence, like a phantom exhalation of air that Izuku can't quite grasp. Izuku's gaze lingers on the space where the man had stood, his eyes searching for something, anything that might anchor him to the moment. But there's nothing. The crowd has swallowed him whole, leaving behind only a hollow absence that seems to echo in Izuku's chest. His mind replays the scene in jagged fragments, each one cutting deeper than the last. The hero's showmanship, loud and commanding, is like a storm demanding attention. The rubble crashing down, its deafening roar still ringing faintly in his ears, accompanied by the acrid tang of dust in the back of his throat. And then there was the stranger, moving without hesitation, without fanfare, as though he belonged to a different world entirely, one where the chaos and noise held no power over him. His movements had been deliberate yet unassuming, purposeful yet quiet, like the steady pulse of a heartbeat. The word hangs in the air like a ghost, drifting into space between Izuku's scattered thoughts. Justice. It's a word he's held on to for so long, a cornerstone of his very existence. And yet, as he stands there, rooted to the spot while the world moves on around him, he feels it slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. The word feels foreign now, unfamiliar and distant, as though it belongs to someone else entirely. The ideals he's clung to for so long suddenly feel fragile, like a threadbare tapestry unraveling before his eyes. He wants to reach out, to grab hold of it, to mend the fraying edges and weave it back together. But he doesn't know how. He doesn't even know if he should. For the first time, Izuku realizes he isn't sure he understands what that word really means anymore. The weight of that realization presses down on him, heavy and suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. It's not just the word itself, it's everything it represents, everything he's built his life around. What is justice, really? Is it the bright, shining ideal he's always believed it to be? Or is it something darker, something messier and more complicated? Is it the hero standing tall in the spotlight, or the shadow that moves quietly through the crowd, unseen and unacknowledged? His chest tightens as the questions swirl in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. He feels a pang of something he can't quite name: loss, maybe, or doubt, or fear. It's as though the foundation beneath his feet has shifted, leaving him unsteady and unsure of where to step next. The crowd moves around him, a sea of faces and voices and bodies, but he feels utterly alone, adrift in a storm of uncertainty. And yet, amidst the chaos of his thoughts, A single image lingers in his mind: the man in the trench coat, disappearing into the crowd with the ease of smoke through fingers. There was something about him, something that felt true, in a way that Izuku can't explain. It wasn't the kind of truth that shines brightly for all to see. It was the quiet, unassuming kind, the kind that slips through the cracks and settles in the shadows. Izuku doesn't know what to make of it, but he can't shake the feeling that he's just witnessed something important, something that will change him in ways he doesn't yet understand. And as he stands there, staring at the space where the man had been, he knows one thing for certain. He has more questions than answers, and the path ahead is anything but clear. Unknown to the young boy, you wouldn't know the answer to this question until years later. The delivery of cameras to the scene occurred with greater speed than the arrival of ambulances. The cameras were on site quicker, preceding the emergency medical services personnel who were dispatched in ambulances. The first news van screeched into view, its tires screaming against the cracked asphalt and leaving faint black streaks in their wake. The vehicle seemed almost alive, a beast with a garish neon logo that glared through the choking haze of dust and smoke like a beacon. The air reeked of burning plastic and scorched metal, the acrid scent stinging noses and throats alike. Before the van had fully stopped, the passenger door burst open with a metallic groan. A woman emerged, her tailored blazer and pencil skirt somehow immaculate despite the chaos around her. She moved with sharp, deliberate strides, her manicured fingers already adjusting the sleek earpiece nestled against her ear. There was a feral energy to her movements, her polished leather shoes crunching over broken glass and debris as if she didn't even notice the jagged edges. Her eyes were locked ahead, unblinking, laser-focused on the hero standing at the epicenter of the wreckage. Behind her, the camera crew fumbled and stumbled, struggling to keep pace. One of them cursed under his breath as he tripped over a chunk of concrete, the heavy equipment on his shoulders swaying precariously. The other adjusted the massive lens with practiced urgency, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt for the perfect shot. The camera's red light blinked to life, its unyielding gaze sweeping over the devastation. The skeletal remains of buildings, the twisted wreckage of cars, the faint shimmer of heat rising from smoldering embers. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, its mournful cry cutting through the heavy silence. But it was still too far off to matter. The hero stood at the heart of it all, his figure framed by the jagged outlines of destruction. His chest heaved with each labored breath, his singed and tattered cape hanging limply from his shoulders. His face, streaked with soot and grime, was a mask of exhaustion. For a fleeting moment, a crack appeared in his carefully constructed armor. His hands trembled, the faintest quiver betraying the strain of what he had endured. His gaze darted briefly to the ground, where a child's broken toy lay half buried in the dirt, its painted smile now smeared with ash. His shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of the lives he had saved and the ones he hadn't. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Like a curtain drawn across a stage, his expression shifted. The weariness was swept away, replaced by a calm, composed demeanor. His spine straightened, his chin lifted, and the haunted glint in his eyes dulled into something measured, something controlled, something that would look good on camera. The reporter, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the humanity she had just witnessed, pressed forward. Her heels clicked against the pavement, a sharp, staccato rhythm that echoed in the stillness. She pushed her microphone toward him, her voice a honeyed blend of urgency and faux concern. "Can you tell us what happened here?" she asked, her tone carefully calibrated to convey just the right mix of sympathy and intrigue. The hero hesitated, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. His mind raced, replaying the chaos of the last few hours. The roar of collapsing buildings, the screams of the trapped and terrified, the searing heat of flames licking at his skin. He could still feel the rough texture of crumbling concrete beneath his fingers, the desperate weight of a child he had pulled from the rubble, their tiny arms clinging to his neck as if he were their last hope. He could still hear the deafening silence that followed when he realized he hadn't reached everyone in time. He hesitated just long enough for his gaze to flicker toward the shattered storefront, where jagged shards of glass clung stubbornly to the twisted metal frame. The faint, acrid tang of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and scorched concrete. The bent street lamp still sparked weakly, its bulb flickering like a dying star against the murky backdrop of rising ash. His eyes caught on the small figure of the girl curled against the remains of a wall, her dress gray with dust, the once bright fabric dulled and torn. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if trying to hold herself together. A low, keening whimper escaped her, barely audible over the distant wail of sirens. The sight made his jaw tighten, the muscles clenching so hard it sent a dull ache radiating up to his temples. For a moment, something twisted inside him, a sharp pang of guilt, or maybe shame. He wasn't sure which. He told himself it didn't matter. His hand twitched at his side, as if some part of him wanted to reach out, to cross the distance and offer comfort. But instead, he forced himself to turn away just enough, just a fraction, angling his body toward the cameras instead. The movement felt mechanical, deliberate, like a soldier following orders. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady now, the earlier roughness smoothed out as if by sheer will. It sounded foreign even to his own ears, detached and practiced. It was a tough one. The reporters surged closer, their footsteps crunching over debris. Microphones jutted toward him like the tips of spears, their black foam heads bobbing in the smoky haze. Questions flew at him, rapid fire, their words overlapping in a chaotic tangle. He didn't flinch. With each answer, his tone grew sharper, more polished, the edges of his words honed to a fine point. His gestures became broader, more calculated, as though he were conducting a symphony of devastation. He pointed to the wreckage with a sweeping motion, his hand cutting through the air like a blade, as if to frame the destruction as a necessary sacrifice, as if it had all been part of some grand, unassailable plan. But beneath the surface, his thoughts churned like a storm-tossed sea. He could still feel the weight of his mistake, the split second of panic that had tightened his chest and sent his quirks spiraling out of control. The memory of the blast was seared into his mind, the deafening roar, the blinding flash of light, the way the ground had buckled and split beneath his feet. He had felt the heat of it on his skin, the force of it rattling his bones. And then the aftermath, the screams, the smoke, the blood. The girl. "I had to push him into a corner," he declared, his voice rising slightly as he gestured toward the gouged pavement. The words came easily now, almost too easily, slipping off his tongue like oil. A chunk of concrete lay nearby, jagged and raw, its edges stained with soot. Twisted rebar jutted out like broken ribs, a stark reminder of the power he had unleashed. The villain's quirk gave him too much mobility. If I hadn't cut off his escape routes, more people would have been hurt. The explanation sounded convincing, even to him. It was clean, logical, and above all, it was necessary. That was what mattered, wasn't it? The greater good. The ends justify the means. He repeated the words in his head like a mantra, trying to drown out the gnawing doubt that clawed at the edges of his mind. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low hum of approval or perhaps uncertainty. He couldn't tell. The cameras flashed, their bright bursts momentarily blinding him, and he blinked against the onslaught of light. Somewhere behind him, the girl let out another soft, shuddering sob. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Instead, he squared his shoulders, lifting his chin just enough to project confidence, authority. Nearby, a woman coughed into her sleeve, her face streaked with dirt. That was no escape route, she muttered, too low for the mics to catch. He just missed, but no one corrected the hero. Instead, the crowd began shifting, adjusting first their expressions, then their convictions. The words accidental and reckless dissolved under the hero's retelling. Tactical necessity, someone repeated, nodding along. Calculated risk, another agreed, though their voice lacked conviction. The transformation was almost hypnotic. The more the hero spoke, his voice a smooth, commanding baritone that carried effortlessly over the chaos, the more the streets seemed to shift. What once looked like a disaster zone, a jagged mess of shattered glass, crumbled concrete, and twisted metal now appeared eerily orchestrated. It was as if every piece of debris had been carefully placed for maximum visual impact, each crack in the pavement a deliberate stroke in some grand tragic tableau. The acrid tang of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of blood, but even that seemed to fade into the background as the hero's words filled the space, weaving a spell that dulled the sharp edges of reality. And the girl? She kept crying, not the kind of loud, heaving sobs that demanded attention, but a quiet, relentless weeping that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, as if the tears were drawn from a well that would never run dry. Her small hands trembled as they pressed against the fractured wall, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of the cracks. She moved with a kind of desperate precision, like she believed, truly believed, that if she just found the right piece, the right angle, she could fit it all back together again. Tiny flecks of brick dust clung to her skin, mixing with the streaks of dirt on her cheeks, but she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. No one knelt beside her. No comforting arm wrapped around her shoulders. No soothing words whispered in her ear. The world had turned its back on her grief, leaving her alone in her silent battle with the broken wall. The crowd didn't see her, or if they did, they didn't care. They were transfixed, their attention riveted to the man standing tall amidst the wreckage, his cape fluttering dramatically in the faint breeze. No microphone was offered to the girl. No one leaned down to ask her name or hear her story. Instead, a sea of phones rose into the air, their lenses glinting in the dim light as they captured the hero's every move. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all focused on him. The perfect angles, the calculated tilt of his head, the way he paused, just for a moment, to let the weight of his words sink in, before flashing that trademark grin, a smile so practiced, so polished, it could have been sculpted from marble. He turned slightly, catching the light just so, and the crowd gasped as if on cue. The once horrified murmurs had transformed into an excited hum, a current of energy that pulsed through the gathering like an electric charge. People jostled for a better view, their faces alight with anticipation. Somewhere near the front, a teenage girl, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide, clutched her friend's arm. "Do you think he'll sign?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and urgency. She glanced down at the glossy photo clutched in her hand, the edges curling slightly from her grip. It was a picture of the hero, mid-flight, his face set in a look of fierce determination. She held it like a talisman, her fingers tracing the bold, looping signature already scrawled across the bottom. But one wasn't enough. She wanted more. She needed more. Her friend, a boy with a mop of unkempt hair and a skeptical expression, shrugged. "Maybe," he said, though his tone was far from certain. His gaze flicked to the hero, then back to the girl. "If you can get close enough." The girl bit her lip, her eyes darting to the crowd around her, assessing her chances of escape or perhaps a moment of recognition. She didn't notice the crying child, just a few feet away, whose soft, broken sobs reverberated faintly off the walls, lost in the noise. None of the onlookers noticed either. Their attention was entirely consumed by the hero, a figure who commanded every gaze, every whisper. The girl, with her trembling hands and unchecked tears, was rendered invisible in the shadow of his presence. The hero chuckled, a sound that was both sheepish and rehearsed, as he reached for the pen clipped to his belt, ready to sign autographs. "Come on, guys, I was just doing my job," he said, his voice warm and inviting, his words crafted to charm. His smile, dazzling and practiced, lit up the faces of those around him. Meanwhile, behind him, far from the glow of the cameras and the adoration of the crowd, the girl wiped her tear-streaked face with dusty palms. She shrank into herself, unnoticed and insignificant, as the world's focus remained firmly fixed on the hero. Izuka stood at the far edge of the gathering, just outside the tight ring of onlookers and equipment. From where he was, he could see everything: the worn edges of the hero's gloves, the press badges swaying from lanyards, the news anchors rehearsing their lines under their breath. He watched as the hero's exhausted grimace softened into something bright and photogenic, teeth flashing, eyes crinkling in that familiar, marketable way. He had seen that smile everywhere on posters, billboards, and in countless commercials. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope carefully crafted for the public. But seeing it now, freshly plastered back onto the hero's face mere minutes after the explosion that had shaken Izuku to his core, made his stomach churn with unease. The word rehearsed came to mind immediately. That smile wasn't just spontaneous, it was calculated. Every detail about the hero seemed meticulously planned: the angles of his grin, the subtle tilt of his head when cameras flashed. It was all too smooth, too deliberate, as though every moment had been fine-tuned for perfection. Earlier that day, Izuku had tried to shake off the nagging thought that hero work had become a kind of stage play, that the pacing, the banter, the big finishing moves were as much performance as they were protection. He'd told himself he was just being cynical, that he was seeing patterns that weren't really there. The acrid smell of dust filled his nose, mingling with the sound of a child crying softly behind him, a sound that tugged at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't convince himself to believe in the ideals he once held so tightly. The artificiality he had always questioned now felt undeniable, like a thin, suffocating film draped over everything around him, tainting it. Crossing his arms tightly over his chest, his fingers pressed hard into his elbows, a subconscious attempt to ground himself. Nearby, the hero laughed at a reporter's comment, his voice ringing out confidently. The crowd of fans surrounding him erupted into laughter, their admiration palpable, their joy infectious. Izuku remained motionless, his posture firm and unwavering. He didn't laugh or join the crowd's energy. Instead, his gaze lingered, steady and probing, as though he were trying to uncover a truth hidden beneath the surface of the moment. For the first time, the word hero felt different to him, heavier, complicated by concepts it had never been tied to before. Marketing strategies, public image manipulation, and the allure of spectacle over substance. It left an unfamiliar weight in his mind, a dissonance he couldn't shake. As he finally turned away, the sun had dipped lower, casting a softer light across the scene. The distant wail of sirens grew fainter, blending into the background noise, while the relentless flashes of cameras continued to capture every angle of the aftermath. Without a word, he walked away, his steps deliberate, as if carrying the burden of a realization he wasn't yet ready to voice. The city moved around him in its usual rhythm, cars passing, chatter spilling out of open storefronts, the faint rumble of a train somewhere below his feet. But all of it felt muted, distant, like he was submerged underwater and everything else was on the surface. Each step was heavier than it should have been. Izuku wasn't just physically exhausted. It felt as though his very thoughts had grown heavy, dragging him down, pressing against his ribs with an invisible weight. The memory of the stranger lingered relentlessly, the man in the trench coat, standing unshaken amidst the chaos. His voice, rough and gravelly like stones scraping over concrete, echoed in Izuku's mind with unnerving clarity. "This is what you call justice, kid?" The question, delivered with biting precision, had embedded itself deep within him. It wasn't just a passing remark, it was a challenge, a condemnation that replayed every time he blinked, as if the words had been etched into the walls of his mind. "This is what you call justice?" The words brought flashes of the day's events, the deafening blast, the terrified girl, the crumbling wall. The images collided in his thoughts, and as he walked, he squeezed his eyes shut mid-step, nearly stumbling. He'd always believed justice was something pure, radiant, a beacon of hope you could capture in a photograph. He'd grown up watching heroes lift rubble, save lives, and stand tall against destruction, their smiles a testament to their noble cause. But today, that vision had fractured. At a crosswalk, Izuku came to a halt and glanced upward. Towering above him was a massive billboard, its vibrant display impossible to ignore. It featured today's celebrated hero in all his glory, a crimson cape billowing dramatically, teeth gleaming in a perfect smile, with a city skyline painted behind him like a theatrical set. The colors were bold, almost blinding, the red of the cape clashing against the serene blue of the sky. Garish, The word struck Izuku immediately. Not awe-inspiring, not heroic, just garish aloud. Exaggerated display meant to demand attention. It was a far cry from the ideals he'd once held so tightly. He thought of the way that same cape had whipped through the dust moments before the explosion, more theatrical flourish than calculated maneuver. Of the way its edges had caught the light just right when the camera zoomed in. And then he thought of the man in the trench coat. No cape, no insignia, no carefully styled hair. Just a long, worn coat and a presence that didn't need volume to be noticed. The man had moved with a kind of quiet, unshakable certainty, like he'd stepped into the chaos not to be witnessed, but because it was necessary. There had been no pause to address the cameras, no glance to assess the audience. Just pure, unhesitating action. The kind of action that left no room for pretense, no space for self-awareness. It was raw, instinctual, and utterly consuming, like a flame devouring oxygen in its path. The air around still seemed to hum faintly with the echoes of that moment, the weight of it pressing against Izuku's skin like an invisible current. Izuku swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat making the motion almost painful. His tongue felt like sandpaper, his lips cracked from the cold wind that whipped through the streets. Yet it wasn't the chill that had stolen the moisture from his mouth, it was the memory. The vivid image of that man, etched into his mind with a clarity so sharp it felt like it had been burned there. He tilted his head back, his eyes locking on the billboard looming above him. The hero displayed there was larger than life, every inch of him radiating confidence and power. The bright lights illuminated the figure, casting it in a golden glow that seemed almost divine. The colors were bold, the pose triumphant, the smile carefully crafted to inspire hope. It was the kind of image that demanded attention, that commanded admiration. People walking by paused to glance up, their faces briefly lit by the glow, murmurs of awe passing between them. But Izuku's gaze didn't linger. His mind was already elsewhere, caught in the stark contrast between the hero on the billboard and the memory of the man he had seen earlier. That man had been a near anonymous silhouette, his figure shrouded in shadows and debris. There had been no light to highlight his features, no crowd to cheer him on. His coat had been tattered, efficient, as though every second mattered. He had melted into the chaos as quickly as he had emerged from it, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his presence, a ripple in the air, a fleeting sense of something extraordinary. Both had faced danger head-on, both had acted without hesitation, but only one of them seemed entirely indifferent to recognition or applause. The thought struck Izuku like a stone to the chest, the weight of it settling heavily in his mind. He found himself wondering what drove a person to act without expectation, without the promise of acknowledgement. Was it bravery, or something else entirely? As Izuku continued his walk, the city streets began to blur into a repetitive, familiar pattern. The rhythmic clatter of his shoes against the pavement became a steady backdrop, the sound merging with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chatter of passers-by. The cold wind bit at his cheeks, carrying with it the faint scent of exhaust and street food. Neon signs buzzed softly above him, their colors bleeding into the night like smudged paint. But none of it registered fully. His surroundings faded into a haze, his focus narrowing inward as his thoughts began to shift. Not on the hero plastered across the billboard, his larger-than-life image still glowing faintly in the corner of Izuku's vision. Not on the enigmatic man in the coat, whose shadow seemed to stretch long and dark in his memory, but on himself and the questions he was too afraid to answer. The ones that twisted in his chest, sharp and unrelenting. What kind of hero did he want to be? Was he chasing this dream for the right reasons? Did he have what it took to face danger without the need for validation, to act purely for the sake of others? Or was he just another boy looking up at the billboards, hoping to see his own face staring back one day? The questions gnawed at him, each one heavier than the last. He clenched his fists, the rough fabric of his gloves pressing into his palms. The city around him seemed to grow colder, the wind sharper, the lights harsher. And yet, somewhere deep within him, a spark flickered, a small, stubborn ember of determination that refused to be snuffed out. He didn't have all the answers. Not yet. But as he walked on, his steps steady and unyielding, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stop now. Not until he found the truth. Not until he figured out who he was meant to be. Even if it meant facing those questions head-on, no matter how much they scared him. He saw it again the instant when the blast had flared, when debris had rained down, when the girl had screamed. The memory replayed with cruel clarity. In every version, he stood there on the edge of the chaos, heart pounding, lungs burning, and did nothing. His feet refused to move, as if weighed down by invisible chains. He wanted to every fiber of his being screamed at him to surge forward, to shield someone, to do anything but stand there like a statue. Yet, he remained rooted to the spot, trapped in a body that betrayed him, a body that refused to obey even the most desperate commands. What kind of hero can't even take one step? He muttered under his breath, the words sharp and bitter, like shards of glass cutting into his throat. For as long as he could remember, he had poured his life into preparation. Notebooks filled with intricate plans, detailed observations, and carefully crafted strategies littered his room. He had dissected every heroic move he could find, memorized endless statistics, analyzed countless quirks, and cataloged strengths and weaknesses with meticulous precision. He had convinced himself that preparation was a power all its own, a weapon as sharp as any blade. But now, when the world demanded action, when reality called for something beyond scribbled notes and admiration, his endless analysis crumbled to dust. His mind, once so sharp, was a void. His body, once so sure, was a prison. Was this all his dream amounted to? A hollow, childish fantasy? A comforting story, he told himself, to feel closer to the heroes he idolized. Without ever truly testing if he could stand where they stood, he bit down on the inside of his cheek, hard enough to make him bleed. The metallic tang filled his mouth, grounding him, but it did nothing to dull the ache in his chest. "I'm pathetic," he whispered, the words barely audible in the stillness. No one was there to hear him, but the truth of it echoed in his mind, unrelenting. The word didn't bring relief. It didn't wash over him like a confession or free him from his torment. It just sat there, heavy and cold, sinking deeper into the pit of his stomach. He had wanted justice. He had wanted to help. But when it mattered, he'd been just another bystander, no different from the ones who had turned away from the weeping girl to chase autographs. By the time Izuku reached his apartment, the sky had dimmed to a dull, bruised blue. The hallway lights buzzed faintly as he slipped off his shoes and stepped inside. The familiar clutter of his room greeted him. Stacks of notebooks, hero posters curling at the edges, pens scattered across his desk. Normally, the sight would have grounded him, a reminder of all the hours he'd spent studying, preparing, building his dream one fact at a time. Tonight, a weight settled heavily in his chest, constricting his breath with an almost suffocating grip. The room was dim, shadows pooling in the corners, but his focus was drawn to the stack of notebooks on the desk, their spines worn and pages slightly curled. He moved across the room with purpose, his hand instinctively reaching for the nearest one-hero analysis for the future number 9. The cover felt soft and familiar beneath his fingers, the texture telling stories of countless hours spent poring over its contents. He flipped it open, and the pages fanned out, revealing a meticulous collection of sketches and notes. Diagrams of heroes frozen mid-action sprawled across the sheets, each surrounded by arrows that mapped out intricate motion paths. Notes crowded the margins, detailing how specific attacks appeared from different angles. There were analyses of catchphrases, the timing of smiles, and the precise duration heroes held their triumphant victory stance before easing into relaxation. He had even underlined the phrases that resonated most with fans, the ones they repeated like mantras. Calculated poses, he murmured, realization weighing his words. He flipped through the pages, finding only strategies, patterns, and rehearsed perfection. Scripts, he whispered, the word him with a quiet but devastating force. All of it, this entire notebook, wasn't just about saving lives. It was about the performance of saving lives. The angles, the sound bites, the carefully choreographed movements, each one designed to craft an image, a narrative. It was heroism turned into spectacle, a shadow play that masked the raw, unpolished reality beneath. His chest tightened further as the weight of it all pressed down on him. His fingers trembled as he closed the notebook, the sound of the cover snapping shut sharp in the silence. He tried to reassure himself, to push back the unease gnawing at him. It wasn't useless, he reasoned. Understanding how heroes operated in the public, I wasn't inherently wrong. But if this was all he had learned, if this was the sum total of his studies, then he had been chasing reflections on a wall, blind to the fire that cast them. With a deliberate slowness, he placed the old notebook down on the desk, its weight feeling heavier than it should. His gaze shifted to the stack of fresh notebooks still wrapped in their thin plastic casing. Reaching out, he tore the plastic open, the sharp sound breaking the stillness of the room. He pulled out one pristine notebook and set it in the center of his desk, its blank cover staring back at him like a challenge. For a long moment, he simply sat there, the pen hovering above the untouched surface. His mind swirled with thoughts, doubts, and a newfound determination. Finally, with measured precision, he pressed the pen to the cover and wrote a title in bold, deliberate strokes. The Reality of Justice. The words stood out, stark and almost accusatory, against the pristine surface of the page. Their sharp contrast felt appropriate, resonating with the weight of what needed to be expressed. Izuku opened to the first blank page. The vast, untouched emptiness stared back at him, both intimidating and strangely liberating. It was a canvas of endless possibilities, waiting to be filled. He placed his pen down gently, but instead of writing, his hand moved instinctively to sketch. Slowly, deliberately, he began to draw. Line by deliberate line, the memory of the man in the trench coat emerged from the void. The heavy, weathered drape of the fabric that seemed to carry its own history, the slightly askew collar that hinted at a hurried moment, the firm, unyielding set of his jaw that spoke of resilience. And then there were his eyes, tired, sharp, and unwavering, piercing through the chaos of smoke and noise, seeing straight to the heart of the truth. Each stroke of the pen captured the essence of the man. His stance was unremarkable at first glance, neither ostentatious nor meek, yet it held a quiet strength. It was solid, grounded, and utterly sure. He stood as if the world could not shake him, as if he were the anchor in a storm. Beneath the sketch, Izuku finally began to write. He moved like he already knew no one would cheer, like he had made peace with that long before. There was no hesitation in his steps, no glance toward the cameras or the crowd. He simply acted as though the only thing that mattered was the moment itself. His pen glided steadily across the page, the faint scratching sound filling the quiet room. Each stroke carried weight, not of dramatic flair or showmanship, but of deliberate choices, of priorities. He captured the moment when the man had bypassed the reporters entirely, heading straight to the injured without hesitation. No cameras, no applause, just action. Izuku paused, his gaze lingering on the words he had just written. This notebook, he resolved, would be unlike the others. It wouldn't be crammed with dynamic sketches of heroic poses or catchy slogans meticulously crafted to ignite hope. There would be no rehearsed lines for grand entrances, no glossy, larger-than-life depictions of heroism that he had spent years idolizing. This time, the pages would bear the weight of something raw, something unvarnished. They would hold the jagged, uncomfortable truths that refused to conform to a tidy narrative. Truths that didn't shine under spotlights or fit neatly on billboards. This notebook would be a record of justice as it truly was messy, imperfect, and stripped of any pretense. It would capture the moments that weren't meant to sell an image, the kind of moments that existed in the shadows, unseen and unsung. Leaning back in his chair, Izuku let out a slow breath, the stillness of his room pressing down like a heavy blanket. His eyes scanned the lines he had written so far, the starkness of the words staring back at him. They felt heavier than anything he had ever put to paper. He could feel the shift, the gravity of this new purpose settling in his chest. To find the truth, he murmured, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile clarity of the moment. The thought lingered, expanding in his mind like ripples on water. Slowly, he picked up his pen again, the tip hovering just above the page. "That I have to stop looking at the stage," he said, this time with quiet conviction. The words flowed onto the paper with a finality that sent a shiver coursing through him. This wasn't just a decision, it was a turning point. His hand moved with purpose as he underlined the next line, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. "Start looking into the void where the real work is done." The thought unsettled him deeply, like a cold wind slicing through his core. The void wasn't just an emptiness. It was a mirror, reflecting everything he wished to keep hidden from the world. The doubts that gnawed relentlessly at his confidence, the failures that clung to him like shadows, and the raw, unfiltered ugliness he buried beneath layers of denial. It was the sum of every choice that lacked grandeur, no dramatic camera angles to frame his actions, no soaring orchestras to drown out the weight of his missteps. Yet, if he ever wanted to see himself as a hero and truly believe it, he couldn't keep grasping at the polished fragments of his narrative, the ones that sparkled like jewels in a carefully curated highlight reel. True heroism demanded more. It meant staring down the unvarnished truth, even the jagged edges that made his chest tighten with fear. He closed the notebook with deliberate precision, his fingers brushing the freshly etched title as though sealing a pact with himself. For the first time since the explosion, the suffocating heaviness pressing against his ribs shifted. It didn't dissolve into nothingness, but it morphed no longer an amorphous dread, but a sharp, cutting clarity, something with a purpose, coiled within it. Comfort hadn't found a home within him. It wasn't a gentle ease that had seeped into his very being. Instead, a stark resolve had taken root, an unyielding force settling deep into his bones. This wasn't a placid acceptance, but something raw and untamed, a strength born not of peace but of struggle. It possessed none of the softness of contentment, but rather the rigid hardness of iron, the kind painstakingly forged in the heart of a relentless flame, tempered by heat and pressure into something unbreakable. It was a resolution tested and proven, unbending and absolute. He had no idea where this new path would lead him, whether it would twist through shadowed valleys or ascend merciless peaks. The uncertainty gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, but he pushed it aside. He didn't know if he possessed the strength to endure the trials that loomed ahead, trials that whispered promises of pain, sacrifice, and transformation. Yet, amidst the chaos of his doubts, one truth had crystallized in his mind, undeniable and immovable, like a beacon cutting through the storm. He would no longer look away, not from the suffering he had ignored for so long, the hollow eyes of the beggar he passed each day, the trembling hands of the woman clutching her child in the rain, the muffled cries of those trapped in their own silent despair. Not from the injustices that screamed for action, the whispers of corruption that echoed through the halls of power, the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the voices silenced before they could rise. And not from the reflection in the mirror that had once been a stranger, a reflection he had avoided because it reminded him of his failures, his cowardice, his complicity in a world that demanded more than his indifference. He stood there now, staring at himself, the faint hum of the bathroom light buzzing above his head, the cool air brushing against his skin. His face was pale, the lines etched deeper than he remembered, his eyes carrying the weight of truths he could no longer deny. He reached out and touched the edge of the mirror, his fingers trembling slightly as if the glass might shatter under his touch. The silence in the room pressed down on him, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing. He felt the ache in his chest, a dull throb that reminded him of every moment he had chosen to turn away, every chance he had let slip through his fingers. He lingered in front of the mirror longer than he meant to, fingertips resting against the cool edge of the glass. The faint hum of the bathroom light buzzed overhead, a thin, persistent sound that only made the silence feel heavier. His own reflection stared back at him, eyes ringed with exhaustion, cheeks a little paler than he remembered, jaw clenched just enough to betray the storm he'd been holding in. There was no heroic gleam in his gaze now, no comforting illusion he could hide behind. Just the raw, unsoftened truth of someone who had watched too much and done too little. He followed the faint cracks running along the edge of the mirror with his eyes, each one a jagged reminder of everything he had tried not to think about. The girl's hollow sobs, the way the crowd had turned as one toward the smiling hero, the question that gravel-voiced stranger had carved into him like a brand. "This is what you call justice, kid?" The memory of that voice shivered through his thoughts, rough and unyielding. It wasn't just the words that haunted him, it was the certainty behind them, the way the man had spoken as if he had already weighed this world and found it wanting. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The air felt colder now, brushing across his skin and raising a scatter of goosebumps along his arms. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the glass, half expecting it to ripple beneath his fingers, to reveal some version of himself that wasn't caught between longing and disappointment. Nothing changed. It was still just him. He let his hand fall. Once he was done, he turned away from the mirror. The room beyond was dim, the single ceiling light failing to chase away the deep pockets of shadow that stretched across the walls like echoes of every thought he couldn't silence. He walked slowly to his bed, each step heavy, as though the gravity of his realizations had thickened the air around him. When he sat down, the mattress sagged with a soft creak. The sheets were cold when he lay back, their chill seeping through his clothes and settling into his bones. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. Faint patterns in the plaster swirls, cracks, overlapping lines gave his eyes something to trace while his mind replayed the scenes he could no longer push aside. The blast, the hero's blinding smile, the girl cradling the broken wall as if she could will it whole again. The trench-coated stranger stepping through chaos like it was nothing more than another day. The faces, the voices, the moments they pressed against him from every direction, crowding his thoughts, refusing to be buried. He saw it again, the way he always did when he let his guard slip. The instant the explosion tore through the air, the roar that swallowed every other sound, the spray of debris spinning like shrapnel. The girl's terrified scream sliced through the haze, and in that frozen, stretched-out fragment of time, he stood there on the edge of the chaos, heart pounding, lungs burning, and did not move. His feet had felt welded to the ground. Every instinct in him had screamed to run forward, to shield someone, to do something, but his muscles wouldn't obey. It was as if his body and his will had split apart, the part of him that wanted to act left watching helplessly from behind his own eyes. He'd spent years preparing for that kind of moment. Notebooks filled his shelves and spilled across his desk pages upon pages of detailed observations, statistics, strategies. He had dissected battle footage frame by frame, charted quirks and countermeasures, drawn arrows around heroes in motion to map out their paths with surgical precision. He had convinced himself that this relentless analysis was its own kind of power, a blade he had honed in secret for the day he would finally draw it. But when the world demanded more than ink and diagrams, when reality called for action and not theory, all that preparation had turned to dust. His mind, usually sharp, had gone blank. His body, usually so responsive to his racing thoughts, had become a cage. Lying there in the dark, he bit down on the inside of his cheek until the metallic tang of vital fluid pooled on. His tongue, the pain grounded him, but it didn't ease the weight squeezing his chest. What if they're right? I'm useless, he whispered into the quiet, barely loud enough to hear himself. The word didn't free him. It didn't wash over him like a confession or absolve him of anything. It just settled inside him, cold and dense, sinking deeper and deeper like a stone dropped in a black water. He had wanted justice. He had wanted to help. He had dreamed of standing where his idol stood, of shouldering the burden of danger, so others wouldn't have to. But when it had mattered, when a single step forward could have changed something, he had been just another bystander at the edge of the crowd. No different from the ones who turned away from the weeping girl to chase autographs. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images didn't fade. They only sharpened the hero laughing as pens were pushed toward him, cameras flashing like artificial stars. The girl, smaller than she should have had to be, tracing the cracks of the broken wall with shaking fingers. The question spun slowly in his mind, threading itself through years of memories. Posters peeling on his walls, commercials with triumphant music and perfect smiles. Moments he had watched from sidewalks and park benches, eyes shining, heart pounding with secondhand pride. It had all looked so pure from a distance, clean, noble, uncomplicated. Tonight, that image lay in pieces. His eyelids grew heavy as exhaustion finally began to drag him under. The room around him blurred at the edges, shadows softening, the sharp angles of his furniture dissolving into vague shapes. Still, the doubt remained, clinging to him like smoke. He drew in one last, unsteady breath and, somewhere between waking and sleep, steeled himself not with the naive certainty he used to cling to, but with something quieter, heavier. A readiness not to turn away this time, even if he didn't yet know what that would demand of him. When sleep finally claimed him, it did not bring rest. It swept him instead into a realm that felt less like escape and more like a confrontation, one that defied the usual boundaries of his imagination. The world around him unfurled in an endless expanse, bathed in a symphony of deep blues and velvety purples. Radiant cyan and shimmering turquoise threaded through the darkness, their light blending seamlessly until the air itself seemed to glow. It wasn't the harsh glare of billboards or camera flashes. It was an ethereal luminescence that made everything feel distant and sacred, as if he stood at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The air felt alive here. Intricate, flowing patterns pulsed through it, ribbons of light that drifted and twined like liquid currents, wisps of smoke, or waves of unseen energy rippling through the void. They moved in synchronized harmony, weaving and unweaving with a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. The dreamscape breathed with them, each inhalation a slow swell of color, each exhalation a muted shimmer. Tiny white dots and luminous sparkles were scattered across the expanse, suspended like distant stars in an infinite sky. Some hung motionless, cold and sharp. Others drifted lazily, leaving faint trails of light in their wake, as though even time moved differently here. Dynamic, organic lines arced through the scene, intersecting and splitting apart, lending the impression that this place was not static but mid-creation, shaping itself around his presence. The entire realm pulsed with an otherworldly energy, subtle yet unrelenting, as though it were a living thing observing him in return. He had the distinct, uncanny sense of being noticed not as an audience member watching a stage, but as someone who had stepped behind the curtain and found the machinery of reality quietly turning, aware of him. He turned slowly, eyes wide, trying to take it all in. The weight he had carried to bed was still with him, but here it felt different. Less like a burden he couldn't bear, and more like a tether keeping him grounded in a place that might otherwise swallow him whole. As he gazed in awe at the mesmerizing surroundings, a subtle shift rippled through the haze in the distance. Colors parted, threads of light bending aside as a figure began to emerge, first a dark silhouette, then the faintest hint of detail. He squinted, his breath lodging in his throat. The shape resolved into a man. Slicked back hair caught the ambient glow and threw it off in hard, deliberate lines. A long trench coat draped from his shoulders, its hem and folds moving not quite with the invisible currents of the dream, but almost against them, as if the man carried his own gravity. The coat seemed to ripple subtly with each step he took, the fabric trailing behind like a shadow trying to keep up. Something inside the boy tightened. There was a familiarity here that went beyond mere resemblance. It wasn't just the slicked back hair or the cut of the coat. It was the way the man held himself, solid, self-contained, utterly unmoved by the strange spectacle around him. The same quiet certainty, the same grounded presence he had seen earlier that day amid smoke and wreckage. Recognition didn't crash over him all at once. It crept in slowly, crawling up his spine and settling at the base of his skull. The man in front of him bore an uncanny resemblance to the enigmatic vigilante who had stepped into the chaos without so much as a glance at the cameras. The one who had carved that question into him with nothing but a sentence. The boy's pulse quickened. A shiver traced along his arms, not entirely from fear, not entirely from awe. It felt instead like standing at the edge of a precipice and realizing that, whether he jumped or not, he would never see the world the same way again. A wave of intrigue, and unease coursed through him. The threads of his waking life and this dream twisted around each other, blurring the line between memory and vision. Had he brought this man here with him? Or had the man been waiting? When the figure finally came to a stop, the distance between them closed to something almost close. The boy could see him clearly now, the hard set of his jaw, the eyes that seemed to carry an entire lifetime's worth of judgment and exhaustion. Those eyes looked at him as if they had already weighed him, as if they could see every moment he had failed to move. The air, or whatever passed for it in this impossible place, vibrated as the man spoke. His voice resonated through the surreal expanse, deep and rough, laden with something that felt too heavy to be called simple. Loud, yet it filled the dreamscape as if the colors themselves were listening. "What's your motivation?" he asked, each word deliberate. "My descendant?" The question struck harder this time, not as an accusation hurled from the edge of chaos, but as a demand issued from the heart of the void itself. And this time, there would be nowhere for him to look away. Izuku's narration. I kept dreaming about that person, the one in blue, with a sword as cold as his eyes. Every time I slept, flashes of a life I'd never lived filled my mind, like memories being forced into place. Far away, a castle with jagged spires rose into the stormy sky. The air was heavy and wet, smelling of rain and electricity. I could almost hear thunder in my chest, mixed with the sound of metal clashing. The battlefield stretched out, littered with broken weapons and armor, the ground stained with vital fluid. Strange voices whispered around me in a language I didn't know, but somehow understood. Their words made me feel urgent, like I needed to do something, even if I didn't know what. But he was always the one I noticed most, the man in blue. Even with everything happening, he stood out, clear against the storm. He faced away from me, his coat blowing in the wind. The Yamato sword in his hand caught the lightning, almost glowing with power. I tried to call out, but the storm swallowed my voice. Still, he turned to look at me. His face was cold and perfect, his eyes sharp and focused. When our eyes met, the dream shattered, and I woke up, gasping in the dark. Last night was even worse. The dream didn't fade. When I woke up, it clung to me, filling my senses. This time, it wasn't just images or sounds. It felt real. I could feel the sword in my hands, the hilt cool and smooth, fitting just right. Power buzzed under my skin, making every nerve tingle with energy that didn't feel like mine. It was like something old had woken up inside me, something that had been asleep for years. My heart pounded, each beat both strange and somehow familiar. When I woke up, my sheets were soaked with sweat, sticking to me and reminding me how intense the dream had been. My fingers twitched, curling as if they still remembered holding the Yamato, its weight still there even though I was awake. My heart pounded, matching the chaos in my mind. I sat up and pressed my hands to my temples, trying to shake off the feelings, but they wouldn't leave. They stayed with me, hinting at something I couldn't quite understand. Was this just a dream turning real, or was it something deeper? Maybe it was part of my legacy, a truth hidden in my vital fluid, waiting for its time. Even when I try to ignore it, I can't shake the feeling that this is more than a dream. It's too clear, too strong, too real. And then there's him, Virgil. That name keeps echoing in my mind, louder every day. He isn't just a ghost or something I made up. He feels real, even if I can't reach him. He's always there, just out of sight, a presence I can't escape. Deep down, I know the truth. Whatever this is, it's only beginning. 6 years later. Alderete Junior High. Age 12. The classroom hummed with the particular desperation of teenagers 30 minutes from freedom. Laughter erupted in sharp bursts, ricocheting off scuffed walls plastered with faded hero posters from decades past. Someone's quirk flickered a brief spark of blue light that died as quickly as it appeared. A crumpled paper airplane, folded with the kind of care only boredom could produce, spiraled down from the back row and nose-dived into the trash can with a defeated thud. The door groaned open. Mr. Hayama entered like a man facing a storm. A leaning tower of cream-colored forms clutched against his chest. He paused just inside, His sharp eyes set deep in a face that had seen 20 years of aspiring heroes come and go swept across the room. The noise didn't die immediately. It unraveled, thread by thread, until only the sound of someone's cork-charged pencil tapping against a desk remained. He coughed once, a deliberate sound that landed like a gavel. "All right, listen up." His voice cut through the last whispers. He set the stack down on his desk with a slap that made the wood shudder. "Term's almost over, which means it's time for the annual ritual of lying to yourselves about your futures." A grin split his weathered face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've got your career aspiration forms right here." He patted the stack. "But let's skip the theater, shall we?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble. "I see that limited edition All Might keychain hanging from your backpack, Tsubasa. And Mitsuki, is that a UA pen you're using? You're all aiming for the stars, right?" He didn't wait for an answer. With a theatrical flick of his wrists, he sent the entire stack sailing upward. The forms exploded into the air like startled birds, catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the grime-flecked windows. They fluttered, spun, and drifted down in a lazy, chaotic snowfall. The room detonated. A boy by the window, Kaido, whose quirk let him secrete adhesive from his palms, leaped onto his desk, arms flailing as he slapped at the air, trying to snag forms with his sticky hands. He overbalanced, arms windmilling, and crashed into the neighboring desk, where a girl with iridescent scales across her cheekbones yelped and reflexively hardened her skin. The scales caught the light like oil on water. In the back row, a student with electric fingertips sent up a crackling net of sparks, trying to magnetize the paper. The forms just drifted through, unchanged, and the boy cursed as the feedback stung his fingers. Another student, a kid with telescopic vision, stood on his chair, eyes bulging comically as he tracked individual forms through their descent, calling out coordinates like a deranged air traffic controller. The air thickened with the scent of ozone, burnt sugar, and the vague chemical tang of activated quirks. A girl with prehensile hair snatched 3 forms from mid-air, her locks twisting like eels. Someone else made a platform of hard light, trying to catch them like a net, but the forms passed right through his quirk, only worked on solid objects heavier than a feather. In the center of this storm of ambition and poorly controlled power, 5 students never moved. Hanamori sat with her head propped on one hand, examining her perfectly manicured nails as if the greatest show on earth were happening in her cuticles. Her quirk perfect memory meant she didn't need to scramble. She'd already read the form, even entered. Next to her, Rin Kurosawa stared out the window, his spiky hair casting a jagged shadow across his face. His strength enhancement quirk could have snagged every foe before they hit the ground, but his expression said clearly that none of this nonsense was worth his time. 2 others, a pair of girls with matching smirks, leaned toward each other, exchanging whispers that had nothing to do with career forms and everything to do with the chaos they were orchestrating, punctuated by pointed glances and subtle quirk activations. And then there was Izukiyagi. He sat slumped forward, forehead resting on his crossed arms. His green hair fell across his face like a curtain, the tips brushing against the graffiti-scarred desk. The raucous celebration around him felt distant, filtered through layers of cotton and resentment. Someone's elbow clipped his shoulder as they lunged past. He didn't react. The phantom weight of a sword hilt ghosted against his palm, a sensation he'd been feeling more often lately, especially since the sludge villain incident. A weight that felt more real than the cheap wood beneath his cheek. Nuisances, he thought, the words settling into the hollow space where his childhood dreams had rotted away. Mr. Hayama's smile had vanished, replaced by a thin line. He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp enough to make the snake-haired boy flinch. Yes, very impressive displays of why most of you will fail the provisional license exam on quirk control alone. His voice had gone cold. Rule number 1, which I've written on this board every day for 10 months. No quirk usage in unlicensed settings. This classroom, in case anyone's forgotten, qualifies as an unlicensed setting. A loud, derisive scoff cut through the lingering chatter like a blade. Every head turned. Katsuki Bakugo sat slouched in his seat near the front, his bright red sneakers propped arrogantly on his desk. The rubber soles left faint scuff marks on the wood marks that had been there since September, because no one dared tell him to move them. He slowly turned his head, letting his sharp, crimson eyes sweep across the room with naked contempt. His palms rested open on his thighs, facing upward, and tiny pops of light crackled between his fingers like warning flares. TCH. The sound was a weapon, loaded with disgust. Don't you dare lump my crew and me in with these extras, old man. The room seemed to compress. 3 desks away, a boy with enhanced hearing winced and tapped his ears off. Katsuki's gaze landed on the adhesive-handed boy, who was still picking paper scraps from his sticky palms. With their pathetic quirks, he barked a short, humorless laugh. They should be grateful if they ever get to shine a top hero's boots. The insult hit the back of the classroom like a physical weight, slung from Katsuki's lips with casual cruelty. The rest of you scrubs might as well start practicing how to say welcome to the convenience store now. Save yourselves the disappointment later. A few students flinched as if struck. One boy in the front row, a kid with a rock-textured quirk, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles made grinding sounds. A girl with vine-like hair let out a small, angry hiss, her tendrils tightening around her desk legs. Before anyone could voice their rage, a sharp voice cut through from the left. Quit being so full of yourself, Katsuki. The voice belonged to Mino Ashido, her pink skin flushing darker with anger. She half stood from her desk, one hand braced against the surface. Katsuki's head snapped toward her, his crimson eyes narrowing to slits. A vicious grin spread across his face as tiny explosions crackled to life in his palms. The smell of nitroglycerin, sharp and chemical, filled the air like a warning. "Shut it," he snarled, each word punctuated by a popping blast. Extras should know their place and sit in it. Mr. Hayama, their homeroom teacher, stepped forward with a nervous laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He held up both hands, fingers spread wide, as if physically holding back the tension. Now, Bakugo. Let's keep the peace." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His gaze darted around the room, searching for anything to defuse the situation. "Ah, that reminds me. I heard through the grapevine that we have some future UA hopefuls right here. You, Katsuki, and your sister Katsumi, the Todoroki siblings, and young Izumi Yagi as well. Is that correct?" The energy in the room shifted instantly. The anger didn't vanish, it transformed into something colder. Envy. Awe. Resignation. All eyes swung toward the left-side cluster of desks where the elites sat. Shoto Todoroki didn't turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed forward, his dual-colored hair white on the right, crimson on the left falling like a curtain between him and the rest of the class. His sister Shoka sat beside him, her own split hair a mirror of his. She tilted her head slightly, and they exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but carried entire conversations. Their silence felt heavier than any boast. Next to them, Katsumi Bakugo reclined in her chair with the ease of someone born to command attention. Her spiky blonde bangs framed sharp crimson eyes identical to her brother's, but where Katsuki blazed, she smoldered. 2 short pigtails at her nape softened the look just enough to make it deceptive. A smirk played at her lips as she crossed her arms. "Obviously," she said, her voice crisp and cutting. "Where else would we go?" A few desks away, Izumi Yagi sat perfectly straight. She didn't preen or posture. She simply gave a single, firm nod. Her emerald eyes held a steady light that spoke of years before dawn, of muscles pushed past exhaustion, of a will carved from something harder than bone. The lines of her uniform hinted at the physique beneath broad shoulders, defined arms. She didn't need to shout. Her quiet certainty was louder than any explosion. The classroom buzzed with whispers. "All of them? In one class? Of course they are. Their dads are. Meanwhile, I'm just hoping for a decent support course." Katsumi let out a short, dismissive puff of air. "We've been training for this since we could walk," she added, her tone layered with cool strategy. "Some of us just have the blood for it." The Todoroki twins exchanged another glance. Shoka's lips curved by the barest fraction, not a smile, but an acknowledgement. Katsuki seized the moment, kicking his feet off his desk and standing on it in one fluid, aggressive motion. The wood groaned under his boots. "That's right," he roared, holding up a hand. A flash. Bang explosion erupted from his palm, making several students flinch. The scent of ozone burned the air. "We've either crushed the mock exams or bagged recommendations. UA's the only stage big enough for elites like us." He swept his gaze across the room like a general surveying a battlefield of corpses. "The rest of you? The other schools can fight over the leftovers." Nervous laughter and muttered agreements rippled through the room, but the excitement had a hollow edge now. The gap between them had been measured and found enormous. As the noise began to die down, Mr. Hayama's eyes landed on a figure in the back corner, small, still, almost part of the wall itself. "Yagi," the teacher called, not unkindly. "You're the only one with a blank form." The class didn't just turn. They whipped around, a single organism scenting fresh vital fluid. Pencils stopped mid-doodle. Text message conversations froze. Someone in the front row actually leaned forward, elbows on the desk, chin in hands, waiting for the show. Izuku raised his head. It wasn't the jerky, embarrassed motion of a kid caught napping. It was controlled, almost ceremonial. His spine straightened vertebra by vertebra. His green eyes, when they finally lifted, didn't hold the expected flush of shame. They were clear, distant, and utterly devoid of anything the class recognized. He scanned their faces slowly, methodically, the way you might inventory tools in a box. His silence wasn't empty. It was full-packed with something that made the nearest students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Well," the teacher prompted. "What have you got?" The words came out flat, without hesitation. "Hero." For one perfect second, nobody breathed. Then the room detonated. "Oh my God!" A girl with a lizard tail clapped both hands over her mouth, but laughter spilled between her fingers anyway. "He's not serious. Maybe he's applying as a prop," suggested a boy whose ears spun like wind turbines. "You know, the guy who gets saved in the background. Professional victim." "Check his form," someone else shouted. "Bet he wrote quirk," crying in the abilities section. The laughter wasn't uniform. It came in waves, different pitches and flavors. Some of it was sharp and mean kids who'd been waiting years for this moment. Some was nervous, the laughter of people who sensed something off but couldn't name it. A few at the front just looked confused, like they'd missed the punchline. Katsuki Bakugo didn't laugh. He sat rigid in his seat, knuckles white against the desk's edge. Sparks danced across his palms, not the usual crackling pops, but tight, contained explosions that left scorch marks on his notebook paper. His jaw worked soundlessly, grinding out a rhythm only he could hear. "Him? After everything? After I told him to die?" Katsumi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Her shark-like teeth caught the light as her smirk softened into something more predatory. She wasn't laughing because this wasn't funny, it was interesting. Izuku's posture was wrong. The angle of his shoulders, the set of his hands loose on the desk instead of clenched. He looked like a different person wearing Izuku's skin. She tilted her head, trying to solve the equation. Izumi, 3 rows up, didn't turn around. She kept her eyes forward, but her grip on her pen had tightened enough to warp the plastic casing. A tiny crack spider webbed across the barrel. Her face was a perfect mask of indifference, but her shoulders had gone stiff, just for a moment. All right, the teacher tried, but his voice drowned in the tide. Bakugo moved. He didn't stand so much as erupt from his seat, a blur of blonde fury that covered the distance between their desks in 3 violent strides. The air around his right hand shimmered with heat. When his palm slammed down, it wasn't just a hit, it was a detonation. The sound cracked against the walls like a gunshot. Izuku's desk jumped, one leg lifting off the floor before crashing down again. Pencils scattered. A notebook flipped open, pages fluttering. The sharp chemical stench of nitroglycerin rolled out in a wave, making the nearest students cough and recoil. Someone's water bottle tipped and spilled across the floor. But Izuku hadn't moved. He sat exactly as before, hands still resting loose on the desk's surface. His hair hadn't even ruffled. He lifted his head slowly, turning it to face Bakugo with the same eerie calm he'd shown the whole class. Their eyes met Bakugo's wild and blazing, Izuku's cool as deep water. For a moment, it looked like they might be having two completely different conversations. Bakugo was screaming without words. Izuku was listening without interest. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down on the classroom, compressing the air until it felt hard to breathe. Even the teacher had gone still, clipboard frozen mid-raise. Izuku's gaze drifted from Bakugo's face to the scorched handprints smoldering on his desk. He watched it for a long moment, then looked back up. His lips didn't move. He didn't speak, but his expression so blank, so utterly unimpressed, said everything. Bakugo's own desk groaned under his clenching fists. Behind him, Katsumi's eyes had narrowed to slits. She'd seen something in that non-reaction, something that didn't add up. And upstairs, hidden in the dark hallway, Izumi's pen finally snapped in half with a sound like a small bone breaking. Izuku let the words settle, his voice carrying no heat, yet cutting clean through Bakugo's sneer like a knife through soft butter. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, green eyes locked on Bakugo's with a stillness that felt wrong, somehow too calm, too certain. You're rabbiting off your mouth because of my choice. It says a lot about what's going to happen if you can't get your way in your hero life. A few nervous giggles bubbled up from the back row, quickly strangled into silence. The rest of the class stopped breathing. The air itself seemed to crystallize, sharp and ready to crack. Bakugo's face flushed crimson. His composure shattered like cheap glass. You think you're funny, Deku? He snarled, venom dripping from every syllable. His palm crashed down on Izuku's desk with a crack that made the whole frame jump. This time, the explosions weren't mere sparks, they were full-throated detonations, crackling bursts of orange and yellow that left scorch marks blooming across the wood like black flowers. The scent of burnt nitrate and ozone filled the classroom, harsh enough to make eyes water. Smoke curled up in thin spirals. Izuku didn't blink. He didn't look at the smoldering desk, or the way Bakugo's sweat-slicked hair clung to his forehead. His gaze stayed fixed, steady, unbothered. The explosions reflected in his pupils, tiny suns burning in deep green pools. But his expression didn't change. That stillness, that refusal to react, seemed to pour gasoline on Bakugo's rage. You think a quirkless nobody like you has any place at UA? Bakugo leaned in close enough that Izuku could feel the heat from his palms, see the veins pulsing in his temples. Spit flecked Izuku's cheek. You're nothing. A stain. You'd be lucky if they let you scrub the toilets there. From 2 rows back, Izumi Yagi's knuckles were bone white where she gripped her pencil. Her telekinesis flickered around her fingers, a barely visible shimmer of displaced air. She wanted to stand, wanted to intervene, but the rules were clear. This was between them. Interfering would make her look weak, like she needed to protect her quirkless brother. She held herself rigid, mouth pressed into a thin, painful line. Katsumi Bakugo watched from her corner seat, one leg crossed over the other, her chin resting on her knuckles. Her crimson eyes tracked the scene like a scientist observing a particularly interesting chemical reaction. She wasn't worried about her twin brother's temper. She was cataloging Izuku's reactions, the way his breathing stayed even, the way his hands rested flat on his desk instead of curling into fists. Something here didn't add up. The Todoroki twins sat motionless as statues, but Shoka's gaze had sharpened. Her icy demeanor cracked just enough for a flicker of genuine curiosity to show. The temperature around her desk had dropped a few degrees, unconscious, but telling. The whole classroom had gone still as prey animals. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, each second thudding against ribcages. Bakugo's free hand curled into a fist, fresh explosions dancing along his knuckles, casting flickering shadows that made his furious face look demonic. The wood beneath his other hand had begun to char, blackening and smoking. The promise of violence hung in the air like a storm about to break. Last warning, Bakugo. Mr. Hayama's voice sliced through, sharper this time, though the slight quiver in his throat betrayed his nerves. Return to your seat. Bakugo's jaw worked, teeth grinding loud enough to hear. For a heartbeat, It seemed he might ignore the order, might let his rage have its way. But then his eyes flicked to the teacher, calculating the cost. With a final, seething glare at Izuku, he yanked his hand back. The explosions died, leaving behind tendrils of smoke and the smell of scorched wood. He turned sharply, every step vibrating with barely contained fury. Izuku finally looked away. His gaze dropped to his own hands, resting palm down on his desk. There was no shake in them, no tremor, just steady, calloused fingers that had spent years gripping tree branches in the dead of night, holding on to ledges until his muscles screamed, learning to move without making a sound. The ghost of a weight pressed against his palm, not the weight of a pencil or a book, but something else. Something with a hilt that felt like it belonged there, like a sword that existed just beneath his skin, waiting for him to call it by name. Meanwhile, downtown, glass shattered in a brilliant, dangerous rain as the shop window gave way. People screamed, ducking behind mailboxes and crouching beside cars, their hands clamped over their heads. From the jagged hole slithered the villain, a heaving, putrid mass of green sludge that pulsed with a sickly light. Its two bulbous yellow eyes darted around wildly, and trapped within its gelatinous body, the shopkeeper flailed, his cries muffled and desperate. "Out of my way!" The villain gurgled, its voice like water choking a drain. A thick, viscous tentacle lashed out, sweeping a man's legs from under him. He crashed into a newspaper stand, sending a flurry of pages dancing into the air. A woman stumbled backward, her bags of groceries tumbling to the sidewalk, apples rolling into the gutter. The villain oozed forward, leaving a glistening, sticky trail that smelled of sewage and rotten eggs. "Somebody call the heroes!" A teenager shrieked, his phone slipping from his sweaty fingers that they're never here when you need them. An old man yelled, shaking his cane as he pressed himself flat against a building wall. Chaos swallowed the street. The sludge villain, absorbing spilled soda and moisture from a broken hydrant, seemed to swell. It slithered into the path of an oncoming taxi. The car screeched, tires smoking, and the driver lay on the horn, one long, useless blare that only added to the din. From the cool darkness of a nearby alley, a pair of sunken blue eyes watched. Yoshinori Yagi, looking more like a forgotten coat rack than the world's greatest hero, tracked the villain's clumsy, destructive path. His mind, sharp as ever, mapped the crisis. One civilian trapped, dozens in panic, property damage escalating. A familiar heat stirred in his hollow chest, the ember that never went out. "This is why I'm here," he thought, his bony fingers curling into fists. Even like this, he sucked in a breath. Deep inside, power roared to life. It was like a dormant star igniting in the void of his ribs. Muscles erupted along his frame, veins like steel cables rising to the surface as his tattered shirt strained and tore. His stature ballooned, casting a sudden, immense shadow down the alley. The transformation wasn't silent. It came with a whoosh of displaced air that whipped up a miniature storm of dust, loose paper, and fast food wrappers. He stepped from the alley mouth, and the sunlight hit him. A little girl, clutching her mother's leg, stopped crying mid-sob. Her wide, wet eyes reflected the impossible blue and red that now blocked her view of the monster. The sludge villain, sensing the change in pressure, swiveled its dripping head. Where a gaunt skeleton had stood, a legend now filled the space. All Might planted his feet, and the cracked pavement seemed to sigh in relief. His smile was a beacon, wide and unwavering, carving a space of calm in the heart of the panic. "Never fear," his voice boomed, not just loud, but solid, a sound you could lean on. It cut through the screams and the car horns, commanding the street into a stunned, breathless silence. "Why?" "Because I am here." For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the villain's wet gurgling. Then the crowd erupted, not in fear, but in a collective gasp of recognition and sheer relief. All Might. It's really him. He stood before them, a monument of certainty against the formless, chaotic threat. School and Izuku began his walk home. However, he decided to detour before heading directly home. As he walked, An explosion suddenly rang out. Curious, Izuku investigated and discovered a villain attack in progress. He pushed his way through the gathered crowd, his eyes landing on a sludge villain holding a hostage. To his shock, the hostage was Katsuki. Izuku could only stand and watch. The air crackled with a primal energy, a chaotic ballet of terror and desperation. He watched, a silent observer to a scene ripped from his nightmares. The sheer, unadulterated fear and panic contorting Katsuki's features were a stark testament to the villain's brutal grip. Katsuki's quirk, a volatile eruption of explosive power, sputtered uselessly against the suffocating hold. Each failed attempt amplifying the raw terror in his eyes. Then, Katsuki's gaze met his. In that fleeting, desperate moment, Izuku saw it a raw, vulnerable plea that pierced through years of accumulated pain and resentment. A visceral urge to turn, to disappear, to let the consequences of Katsuki's cruelty play out, washed over him. He envisioned Katsuki learning a harsh lesson, or perhaps, just perhaps, suffering a fraction of the torment he had inflicted since that fateful day at the court doctor's office. But it was a fleeting thought, a dark whisper quickly drowned out by a more insistent, primal instinct. A powerful, unbidden surge of empathy urged him forward, a desperate need to intervene, to offer aid, to save Katsuki from this abyss. He felt the pull, the undeniable call of humanity, overriding the bitter echoes of past grievances. Before Izuku could fully process this internal conflict, a blur of motion and a surge of adrenaline, someone shoved past him, a whirlwind of determination, and propelled themselves towards the unfolding drama. It was Izumi, her face a mask of fierce resolve, her telekinetic quirk flaring to life in a desperate attempt to wrench Katsuki from the villain's clutches. But the villain's grip was iron, unyielding, and Izumi's efforts, though valiant, proved insufficient against such a formidable force. Then, as if summoned by the very desperation of the moment, a thunderous boom echoed through the shocked silence. A powerful explosion ripped through the air, followed by the iconic, confident stance of All Might, his fist extended in a triumphant declaration. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of adulation and relief washing over them. But Izuku, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, could only stare at the symbol of peace with an expression that spoke volumes of his profound disdain and a deep, burning hate. The cheers of the masses felt like a cruel mockery, a hollow echo against the gnawing emptiness within him. Time skip. Yagi residence. Izuku lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling as if the cracks in the plaster might hold an answer. The question circled in his mind like a vulture over carrion. Why did I want to save him? The words came out as barely a breath. Katsuki Bakugo's face twisted in terror. Not rage kept flashing behind his eyelids. That raw, animal plea in his eyes. Izuku's fingers curled into the bedsheet, knuckles white. Then the voices drifted up from downstairs, muffled but distinct enough to cut through his thoughts. His father's low rumble. Izumi's sharper, more animated tone. Years of being invisible had taught him the architecture of silence. He moved without thought, bare feet finding the floorboards that didn't creak. He eased his bedroom door open just enough to slip through, a shadow in his own home. At the top of the stairs, he paused. The old would groaned if he didn't know where to step. He knew. He flattened himself against the wall, peering through the gap in the banister. He watched the scene below. It unfolded like a play he wasn't meant to see. Tashinori stood in the living room, but not as Izuku had ever known him. He was upright, shoulders back, that impossible smile blazing across his face, even as his body seemed to flicker, like a candle running out of wax. The transformation happened in a sigh of air and a slump of bone. The symbol of peace vanished, and in his place stood the skeletal man Izuku had always called Dad. Izumi stood frozen in the doorway from the kitchen, a glass of water slipping from her hand. It didn't shatter. She caught it mid-fall with a flicker of her telekinesis, but her eyes never left their father. Dad. Her voice cracked. You're All Might? Tashinori's smile turned sad around the edges. Exactly, Izumi. The silence that followed was a living thing. Izuku felt it press against his ribs. He watched his sister's face cycle through shock, disbelief, and then something else, something sharp and hungry. She set the glass down on the coffee table with deliberate care, the clink of glass on wood too loud in the quiet. "How?" she whispered. Tashinori ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Quirks aren't always what they seem. Some are. Pass down." He gestured to the couch, and she sat, perched on the edge like a bird of prey ready to launch. He took the armchair opposite, his frail body seeming to swallow the space. "I need to tell you about my quirk. About one for all." He spoke, and the words fell like stones into a deep well. Each generation passes power forward. A mentor's dying wish. A war that wasn't over. Izuku listened, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. All for one. The name tasted like ash. Tashinori explained how the power was a flame burning through his body now, consuming him from within, how he needed a vessel strong enough to hold it. Izumi leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "So, you need a successor." "Yes." Tashinori's gaze held hers. "And I believe that successor is you." Izuku's breath hitched. He pressed harder against the wall, willing himself to become part of the architecture. Izumi sat back, a flicker of triumph crossing her face before she smoothed it into concern. "Dad, what about Izuku?" She said his name as if it were an afterthought, a pebble in her shoe. "Why not give it to him?" Tashinori's expression didn't change. It was the flatness of it that stabbed deeper than any cruelty. He fumbled for words, the hero's eloquence gone. "Well, he doesn't have the heart for it. The determination. You can't teach that." He looked at his hands, the wasted muscles. "And even if I wanted to, his body couldn't handle the strain. One for all needs someone physically capable. Someone built to be a hero." The words landed like punches, each one to Izuku's psyche. Izumi's lips curved. Not a smile. A blade being drawn. "Oh," she said, voice light as a feather on a grave. "I see. Well, then, Dad." She stood, circling the coffee table to stand before him. "I'll gladly be your successor." Izuku saw it, then the tiny shake in her shoulders, the way her teeth caught her lower lip. Not nerves. Suppressed laughter. She turned slightly, just enough that Izuku caught the side of her face. Her eyes found the stairs for a heartbeat, and he knew she couldn't see him. But she spoke anyway, in that inner voice they all seemed to have, the one that cut deepest. "Guess what, Deku? Even Dad doesn't think you're hero material. This is honestly the best day ever." Neither of them looked up. Neither of them saw the dead, hollow stare from the shadows above, nor the way Izuku's fingers had left deep grooves in the wooden banister. He turned away, but as his body moved on its own, he grew curious and went to search in his parents' room. As he entered, he saw a letter coincidentally lodged on the side of the bed frame on her mother's side. He went towards it and grabbed the letter. Izuku's eyes widened at the name, Hisashi Midoriya Sparta, and it is addressing him. The banister creaked under his white-knuckled grip, the old wood groaning in protest as his fingers dug deep, splintering the polished surface. Izuku held himself perfectly still, a shadow in the dark recess of the stairwell, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the dust motes floating in the dim light. Below, the conversation continued, Tashinori's frail voice explaining, Izumi's calculating responses, but the words had become a distant hum, drowned out by the pounding of blood in his ears. "He doesn't have the heart for it." The phrase echoed, each repetition a hammer strike against something already cracked. Izuku's jaw ached from clenching. He forced his fingers to release, one by one, leaving behind 4 distinct gouges in the banister, a physical testament to a pain he'd never been allowed to voice. He turned away from the scene below, his movements automatic, born from years of practiced invisibility. The floorboards beneath his feet knew his weight. They didn't betray him with a single sound. He drifted down the hallway like a ghost, past the closed door of his own room, the one with the All Might posters he'd torn down months ago. Past Izumi's room, where trophies and ribbons lined shelves she'd never let him touch. He stopped at the master bedroom. The door stood ajar. A sliver of moonlight cut across the dark carpet from the window beyond. Izuku pushed it open wider, just enough to slip through. The room smelled of old cologne and sleep his father's side, and lavender soap from his mother's. The bed was unmade, sheets tossed back from when Tashinori had rushed out earlier. His mother's nightstand held a book, a half-empty glass of water, and a small framed photo of the family from before everything went wrong. Young Izuku smiled in that picture, gap-toothed and unaware. Something else caught his eye. A corner of cream-colored paper, wedged between the nightstand and the bed frame, not quite hidden, but not displayed either. As if it had fallen and been carelessly shoved aside, or perhaps deliberately placed where only someone not meant to find it would look. Izuku's fingers brushed against it. Thick paper, expensive. He pulled it free. No envelope, just a folded letter, the crease sharp and precise. A handwriting he didn't recognize, bold, angular strokes that seemed to cut into the paper itself, was written on the outside. Izuku Midoriya. His pulse stuttered. No one called him that. Not at school. Not at home. He was just Izuku. Or Deku. The name Yagi belonged to his father, to Izumi, to the legacy he wasn't part of. He unfolded it slowly, the paper stiff between his fingers. The first line hit him like a physical blow. To my son, Izuku Midoriya. The letters were dark, pressed into the page with force. He read on, his eyes moving faster than his brain could process. I write this knowing you may never read it, or that you may find it too late. Your mother has asked me to stay away, and for reasons I once thought wise, I have honored that request. But time changes many things, and blood does not forget. His hands began to tremble. Not from fear. From something else, something that felt like the first stirrings of a blade being drawn from its sheath. My name is Hisashi Midoriya Sparta. If you read this, I'm hoping your mother has already remarried and forgotten about my death. You carry my name, though unknowingly, you've been taught to hide it. You carry more than that. You carry a lineage that your mother's new husband, for all his bright glory, cannot comprehend. The words blurred. Izuku blinked hard, forcing his vision to clear. Sparta. The name was a whisper from his earliest memories, a bedtime story his mother used to tell before she stopped looking him in the eye. The Dark Knight. The demon who turned against his own kind. The name that had haunted his dreams like a shadow he could never quite grasp. If you are reading this, then you have likely begun to understand how poorly you fit into their world. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob, entirely broken. He clamped a hand over his mouth, stifling it before it could betray his presence. The paper shook violently in his grasp. The letter continued, but his eyes kept catching on that name. Hisashi Midoriya Sparta. He read it again, tracing each letter with his gaze as if touching a wound. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in the same sharp handwriting, when you are ready to stop asking for permission, find Yamato. The truth is a blade, Izuku. Learn to wield it, and if you are wondering how to find it, you will know. Once your heritage awakens, you'll know. No address. No directions. Just that. Izuku stood there in the dark bedroom, the letter shaking in his hands like a living thing. From downstairs, muffled sounds drifted up: Izumi's bright laugh, Tashinori's weary chuckle, the sound of a family celebrating a future that didn't include him. The noises from downstairs had faded into something worse: celebration. They were probably toasting now. Izumi's triumph, Tashinori's relief, the passing of a torch that had never been his to hold. He read the name again and again. Each time, it carved itself deeper into his mind, into the hollow space where his aspirations had once lived. Hisashi Midoriya Sparta. His father. Not the skeletal man downstairs who had just called him weak-hearted. Not the symbol of peace, who needed someone physically capable. His real father. The letter slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the carpet. Izuku stared at his own hands in the moonlight, thin, scarred from training himself when he fell because no one else would. Hands that had been deemed unworthy. Hands that now held the truth. The letter didn't just slip, it fled, as if the truth it held was too heavy to be contained by human hands. It pirouetted through the still air, corners catching the moonlight like a dying moth before it struck the carpet with a whisper so soft it felt like a secret being told. Izuka's fingers remained suspended in the space where the paper had been, curled into a claw that trembled not with weakness, but with the strain of holding back something that wanted to break free. He stared at his hands. Moonlight poured through the window, cold and merciless, painting his skin the color of old bone. The scars stood out in stark relief, thin, white lines across his knuckles from punching a tree trunk until his vital fluid watered its roots. A jagged slash across his palm from catching a shattered bottle Katsuki had thrown at his head. Tiny burns on his fingertips from building training weights in the shed, stealing his father's tools while the house slept. Each mark was a word in a language only he spoke, a diary of desperation written in flesh. Unworthy. Toshinori's voice echoed in the hollow of his skull. The hands that had caught him 1,000 falls. The hands that had tied his own bandages. The hands that had reached for a dream everyone said was poison. They had been deemed too small, too weak, too human. Now they held the truth, and the truth had weight. It settled into his palms like hot lead, seeping through his pores, traveling up his arms in a burning tide. Something began to awaken inside him. At first, it was just a pressure behind his sternum, like a fist closing around his heart. Then a coldness, not the chill of fear, but the precise, calculated cold of a blade being drawn from a scabbard of ice. It spread through his veins, replacing the vital fluid that had turned to acid with something older, something that remembered battlefields and oaths and the taste of betrayal. His vision sharpened. The moonlight became not just light, but 1,000 individual silver threads. He could see the weave of the carpet fibers where the letter lay, could smell the lavender soap on his mother's pillow from across the room, could hear, with perfect clarity, the clink of triumphant glasses being raised downstairs. In his hair, it started at the roots, a sensation like frost creeping through his scalp, each follicle burning as it surrendered its color. The black drained away as he watched, strand by strand, replaced by a white so pure it seemed to glow in the darkness. Not the white of age or illness, but the white of bone, the white of sword steel in moonlight, the white of something that had been scoured clean of everything it once was. He didn't touch it, didn't need to. He could feel the change like a crown of thorns being twisted into place, each new strand a coronation and a burial both. The truth was a blade, the letter had said. But blades didn't just cut. They remade whatever they touched. He crept back to his room without letting his feet fully touch the floor, not out of any power, but from a silence so deep the boards didn't feel him. The room was a stranger's space now. The hero notebooks stacked on his desk, the homemade weights in the corner, the jar of callus cream by his bed, all of it belonged to a boy who still believed in permission. He took nothing. A note would have been a question mark, and he was tired of asking. The hallway stretched longer than it had any right to. Family photos hung like evidence. His mother's graduation day, his father's old glory, his sister's first trophy. His own school picture had never made it up here. The white hair falling across his forehead caught the weak light from downstairs, bright as a flag he'd never meant to raise. Izumi's laugh floated up, bright and sharp enough to cut. Toshinori's chuckle followed, low and frayed at the edges. The clink of real glass reached him. They were using the good cups, the ones his mother saved, celebrating the future they'd chosen, the one he'd been measured against and found wanting. The brass door handle was ice under his palm. He turned it by degrees, feeling the deadbolt slide back with a snick that vanished under his sister's voice rising in triumph. He stepped through the gap and pressed the door closed until the latch caught with the softest click. Softer than the breath he wasn't holding. The night air hit his face, cool and clean as a new blade. Behind him, the house stood warm and golden, humming with a life that had never made room for him. Ahead, the street disappeared into darkness that didn't promise salvation, just honesty. The darkness waited, patient and complete. Undisclosed location, Japan. The sword's awakening was not gentle. It began as a hum so low it lived in the teeth, a vibration that made the glass case shudder without visibly moving. The blade and okatana caught between the world of katana and nodachi, too long for one name and too stubborn for another breathed. Not metaphorically. The steel itself expanded and contracted, as if drawing lungfuls of the stale air in the darkened room. Its edge, polished to a mirror finish, began to weep light. Not the warm glow of a hero's quirk, but the cold, merciless silver of moonlight trapped in metal. The figure had been sitting motionless for hours, a silhouette against deeper shadows. When the first pulse of power hit, his head snapped up, not in surprise and recognition. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that knew secrets. "Well now," he murmured, his voice a low purr that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "There's the little storm I've been waiting for." He unfolded from the chair with a predator's grace, leather coat creaking like old bones. Each step toward the display case was deliberate, lazy even, but his golden eyes with that strange hazel corona around the pupils never left the blade. They reflected the sword's pulsing light, turning them into twin coins of fire in the darkness. "Hisashi, you oldie," he whispered, pressing a palm against the glass. The surface fogged under his touch, despite the chill in the room. "Your boy's finally listening." The sword responded to the name. Its hum sharpened into a keen, a sound like steel being dragged across stone. The figure laughed a dry, delighted sound that held no actual joy, only amusement at a long-awaited punchline. He traced a finger along the glass, following the curve of the blade. I know, he said, as if the sword were an old friend complaining about the weight. "You wanted him pure, untouched by all that hero nonsense. Well, congratulations. They broke him thoroughly, shattered him into exactly the right shape." Behind him, his wings shifted. 6 of them, black as oil-slick feathers, rustled against each other with a sound like distant thunder. They weren't quite solid, more like shadows that had learned to hold weight, to cast their own deeper darkness. When he turned slightly, the moonlight didn't illuminate them so much as flee from their edges. In the glass reflection, his face hovered above the sword's glowing form. Black hair fell across his forehead, and the tips had bleached to a strong, honey-colored blonde, as if light had dipped them. His features were sharp enough to cut, all angles and cruel beauty, but his smile softened nothing. It was the smile of someone watching a child wander into traffic, curious to see what they do. "They'll come looking for him soon, you realize," he told the sword conversationally. "Tashinori will realize the truth and panic. Inko will cry. The sister will gloat, right until she understands what she's actually won." He tilted his head, considering, or maybe she won't. Humans are so delightfully blind to their own obsolescence. The sword pulsed again, stronger. This time, the glass actually cracked, a spiderweb fracture racing outward from the figure's palm. He didn't flinch. If anything, his smile widened. "Patience, Yamato," he said, and the name felt like a command. "Let the boy take the first step. Let him choose the path, even if every signpost points to the same destination." He pulled his hand back, leaving a perfect handprint etched in frost on the glass. Hisashi wanted him to have that much, at least, the illusion of agency. He stepped back, wings spreading slightly to catch an air current that shouldn't exist indoors. The movement cast the entire room into deeper shadow, making the sword's glow seem suddenly fragile, a single candle in a void. His eyes, though that hazel gold fire didn't dim. "I'm not going to fetch you, Izuku Midoriya Sparta," he said, the playfulness dropping from his voice like a mask, leaving something ancient and terribly sincere behind. "You've found the letter. You'll find the way. And when you do," he paused, and for a moment the reminiscence in his tone held actual warmth, a memory of a different man in a different time. "When you do, I'll be here, with answers sharp enough to make you bleed for asking." The sword gave one final, brilliant pulse, as if in agreement. The crack in the glass deepened. The figure turned away, wings folding back into the shadows they seemed to have birthed. Before he vanished completely into the darkness of the far corner, he spoke one last time, the words floating back like smoke. "I'll be seeing you soon, Izuku." Then he was gone. Only the sword remained, humming its lonely song to an empty room, waiting for the boy who now knew his name. So, this was the end of the series. Stay tuned for next part of this series, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time,